Woody is a passionate Agile coach and guide. He's talking about fantastic products that your team will build, and those products will have the best possible quality available at your organizations. Here, he shares those ideas that will bring your team to the next level of cohesiveness, performance, happiness. Woody is the one who has expertise and he can help. You can also learn what's in common between a rattlesnake and ML programming. But no more talks. Let's dive into that, and I hope that this talk will inspire you for doing software development in a better way. Oh, one more thing. If you like the ideas, please share this video with your friends so they could also improve. And hit that like button. It will help my channel to evolve. Thank you so much. So hey Woody, welcome to another episode of our podcast.
Hey Dennis.
Super nice to have you here. It's a big pleasure.
Well, I'm looking forward to this.
Yes, let's do it. And I mean, traditionally, I start with letting the guests say a couple of words about what you do. And
well, I think of myself as a software developer, although I've only really made my living at it for the last 21 or 2 years. But I started programming in 1983. I messed around with a little bit in 1982. So I've been programming almost 40 years. And the first 20 years, or really first 15 years of me programming, I was always just working on stuff I needed for businesses that I owned and wanted to use in the business. So this I've been doing for a long time. On the other hand, I have many experiences and worked in many different fields. I really love software development, and most of my observations and points I like to make are related to software development. Right now, I'm mostly spending my time going around the world, or virtually going around the world right now, but over the last 5 years, to share the idea of mob programming, which is a way of working that some of your listeners I'm sure are aware of, but where you work with an entire team at creating software sitting around a single computer, or we can do that virtually where we're essentially all looking at the same code and other artifacts like our documentation, writing our emails, writing our tests together, everything that we do. And we work together as a team instead of breaking apart into solo endeavors where we're each working on some part of the bigger thing. We're all working together on this single thing. All the eyes, all the brains working on the same thing at the same time, in the same space, and at the same computer. That's the way I like to think.
This is amazing.
So this is essentially, that's enough of a background. There's not that much. I'm not that complicated of a person.
You're definitely a very experienced person, and this whole idea of doing something together, and the whole idea of the teamwork. How did you get transitioned there from running your own businesses into this, the team paradigm, and how did you end up there?
Well, in a lot of ways, this is a very long story because it was a winding trip, so to speak. I started out as working when I was pretty young, and I think my first job I got when I was 13. I was trying to calculate it out the other day. I wasn't any older than 13, and I got a job at a plant nursery where they grew plants and sold plants for people to plant in their yard. The guy who ran the place, I think, had been a chemist, and he was quite capable with horticulture. He had traveled around the world, at least is what I remember, collecting plant samples to analyze them for their chemical content. And he was hybridizing and raising certain types of flowers, but he also sold general nursery goods. So here I am at 13 years old, and he brings me in on the first day and says something to the effect of, you have 2 jobs here. The first job is you're going to be watering the plants, and each plant has a different watering need, and each species or whatever has a different necessity for how much water it gets, how frequently it gets watered, how much you need to leach the soil to get the salts out, and all this kind of thing. And so he said, you've got to learn a lot to be able to do this job. It's not just putting water in cans. He said, now the plants, they can't stand up and walk over to the faucet to get a drink like you can do. So it's counting on you for its very life and for its wellness. So he was basically telling me, you have an important job and it's not easy. You need to learn a lot to do this. You'll learn it over time. So he was giving me confidence by saying, I know you can do this, basically, but there's a lot to learn. And the second responsibility he told me was, you pay attention to what's going on around you. What things we can improve. So if you notice something you think we need to improve, at the end of each week, you'll come and you'll tell me when you come to get your pay, and explain what you think we can improve, and then we'll make a little plan to make that improvement. As I watched these people work, and it was a very small nursery with maybe 6 employees, but I watched how they worked and how they handled all the different tasks of working together. And it was very much like a teamwork. So as I was there just that first year, customers would ask me questions. I couldn't answer them. So I'd go directly to the boss, and he gave me a book. He said, read this book. You can look up anything anybody asks you is probably going to be in this book. So the point I'm getting at here is I was first introduced to work in an environment that was very encouraging, safe to ask questions, safe to get things wrong, but where they respected even a 13-year-old boy's opinion about what we could improve. And every week we went ahead and we picked something to improve, and he would help me figure out how to do that, and we would do it. So as I went through my life as a just going from thing to thing, I did many things that involved teamwork, such as playing music in bands, or working on a construction crew where we worked as a team, working in other types of work, manufacturing and things where people interacted as a team. And then we get to software development. And this is like many years later. I started working for others doing software development in somewhere around 1998, 99. Up to that time, I was working individually solo programming. And for 15 years or so, because I started programming in 1982 or 83.
Which language was that, or which technology was it?
Language, I learned in BASIC. So I bought a couple. Well, I'll tell that part of the story in a moment.
All right.
So remind me of that, please. Here's the thing. I started working at a company that was actually doing things, I would think, in a very team-like manner. Most of the team sat in the same room. If anybody noticed something, they could mention it out loud and everybody would know that same thing. The main boss, the head person, did not sit in that room, but was in the other room thinking, a lot of the time designing what we're going to be doing. But he would come in and share it at the whiteboard. That became a very important concept to me. You share it at the whiteboard so that everybody gets some kind of a shared memory location where we can go and all know what we are learning together. And then he'd go back and think some more. So this was pretty much a team environment with a leader. And I think it was Brooks who wrote in his book maybe about the surgical team style of teamwork. But anyways, that was great, but that was only a 3-month contract. The second contract I went to, when that one was over, I was put on a team. But the first thing I noticed was we didn't work at all like a team. We were working on the same thing, so to speak. Each team was given a different set of pages for a website, which was for ordering, what this company sold, and that needed to be configured. So they were building a configurator, one of the first ones out there. And but nobody worked as a team. All the tasks were broken up into individuals working on individual parts of things. And after a while, I started noticing this. Why are we calling ourselves teams? So that was a confusion to me. Why do we call this teams? Am I answering the question you first asked? Because I've been rambling quite a bit.
No, this is excellent.
So to get to the point, in 1999, where I started paying attention to the specific, what I would consider specific misfunctions or malfunctions or dysfunctions within these companies I was working at. And I took a bunch of notes and I started discussing with people, why are we a team? Why do we call ourselves a team? And that usually turned out to be because you're either working for the same manager or you're working in the same skill area. Like they have a database team and an architecture team and a front end team and a back end team and so on and so on, and a tools team and a deployment team and object modeler team. So just because we're in the same, so that would like to say, oh yeah, we're playing sports and we have a goalie team and we have a front center team. And so like we have one team that has all these skills and we bring them together so we can play the sport. And so it was confusing a little bit to see us calling things a team. And this is when I really started exploring a lot of dysfunctions. So I noticed communication problems. I noticed the team thing. I noticed a lot of code problems. Like I got raised up in that company to being a team lead almost immediately because I think I looked older than everybody else. And so part of my job was to do code reviews. And I noticed like a lot of the stuff that was checked in for building couldn't even compile. And so it's like, why do we have these kinds of dysfunctions? I noticed dysfunctions about how people were being managed and how the pressure they were being put under and the expectations from them. Someone brought this one up last night at a talk I was doing in a user group. They said that he got dinged in his annual performance review because he wasn't a very good multitasker. And so we will often see in the job descriptions for a new job, they want to hire somebody, and one of the things they must be able to multitask. And then the same person said a couple of years later, his boss said,
must be working well under the pressure.
Must be able to work well under pressure, which is kind of like saying we really are not set up to do things well. If we need people who work well under pressure for doing software development, we definitely have not set ourselves up for success. But he also said, so a couple of years later, the same boss who dinged him for not being able to multitask well is now dinging him, or that means is now giving him less of a quality review because he's trying to do too much. He's multitasking too much. So like this weird, we're expecting you to multitask. We don't want you to be working on too many things. It's like it's all very strange. So anyways, I started taking notes and paying attention to this, and then I started trying to influence these things. So you were asking about the first language I programmed in. Do you want to go back to that?
You remember everything. Yes, let's do that.
No, I don't. All this stuff, like I'll end up answering the wrong question half the time. So I bought a computer. I bought two computers in 1982 or 3 because the industry I was in, which was signage and advertising and graphics design and that sort of thing. I'd worked in printing and I'd started my own little company to make signage. And I could tell that industry was going to be overwhelmed by computers. They started introducing them in the late 70s, but it was very expensive to buy like a mini computer, they used to call them. They were big floor model computers. And then to buy a plotter that would work with it and the other equipment was very, very expensive. I couldn't afford it. Well, in 1982 or so, they started selling very inexpensive computers that could do a limited version of this same work. So I bought one, but I also bought a general purpose computer. And they both worked pretty good, but it was clear to me that the quality of the software was not very good. So the computers themselves functioned. They didn't, overheat or catch on fire. And but the software was terrible. And I kind of thought I maybe need to learn to program so that I could get the software I want to be, functioning. And I started doing that. So I bought a computer. This computer used a CPM operating system, which I think stood for, computer. I'd have to look it up. But basically CPM, I think, was sort of the same thing as what would become DOS. And that CPM operating system that computer came with BASIC, a version of BASIC. So there it was for free, so to speak. It came with the computer. I bought the BASIC language, so that's what I learned in. And I programmed in BASIC almost exclusively for almost 10 years. Try to learn C and then C++, and on to other languages. But I started in BASIC. I didn't care much for C or C++, and I'm really glad that we have many better, what I would consider better for my purposes, languages than that. And I mostly ended up working in Microsoft technologies because that was where the jobs were and my experience was in that area. And then by the time I switched to just working for others doing software development, I had enough skills in that to do that. So I've programmed in Visual Basic and C# and programming languages like that, and a lot of JavaScript in the late 90s. You know why? Because the internet was coming on. I learned to program a little in Java, but the languages almost don't matter. As long as you've got one that you can learn to do something in, they're all the same. The computer can make little decisions, and then you need to operate on those decisions, like change the length of something, or look up something, or loop through something, or whatever. It's a pretty limited thing. As a matter of fact, when I wanted to learn to program, I went to one of my brothers who'd already been programming for a number of years. And I said, hey, I think I need to learn to program. Do you think I could do it? And he said, hey, any idiot can program. And so I think it was his way actually of saying that he felt he was an idiot and he learned to program.
All
But
right.
I took it as meaning he thinks I'm an idiot and I can still learn to program. So I took that and said, okay, I'm going to do it. So I encourage anybody who's interested in programming, if you want to learn it, it's so much easier nowadays because you can go online, look things up in YouTube, look things up in all kinds of websites, lots of free training available. And if you want to pay for training, there's lots of really good training programs.
There are excellent training programs from like world's best universities online now. There's like a website like Coursera where you get those fantastic courses from really, really cool,
Yes,
really educated professors for free.
So I would say there's maybe a warning, and that is that you have to be willing to make a lot of mistakes on the way. And if you, no matter how fast you learn and no matter how good you're going to become, I consider myself purely an average programmer. I just, I've never worked on anything famous. I've never created anything that anybody would know about. But I've been able to write lots of useful software. And if you drop me in with a group of other programmers, I can sit down and work with them, and I'll probably just kind of be one of the other average programmers. So like, this isn't you don't need to be a superhuman to be able to program. You have to be superhuman to put up with all the nonsense that goes on within the environment of the commercial world of software development. You have to learn to put up with quite a bit. But I don't want to discourage you because that's not that much different.
No, and we can discuss that a bit later, maybe in this this episode. For now, I would really like us to look back at the teams, because to me, actually, being able to make a bunch of people working as a team, it's a kind of a superpower. I have seen many people who have tried to do that and they fail, and they hire people like agile coaches or trainers or maybe like lead developers to do that for them. And sometimes those people succeed, and then this is appreciated, or sometimes not appreciated.
Right.
And I think this is a skill. So I had two questions. Like, if you could maybe say a couple of words, what do you consider a team? Because here in Sweden we have quite simple definition of what the team is, and it's basically like, if you could answer the question, if you need each other to achieve the goal, or what is it? You have the common goal and you need each other to achieve it. That's pretty much it. And then
I like that. That's good. That's good. I like that.
It's very simple, and I think most of the teams that I have been working with, they fall into that. And the second question that I would have maybe later, or maybe just now, not to forget it, I would consider a good team a group of people that would not have only the common goal, and they would need each other to achieve that goal. But very often I've noticed that these people are building like another layer of relationship on top of that. So they actually at some point become, connected on some interests. They become friends in some cases. And what do you think about that? If that is important, if that's something you observed or not?
Yeah, I think this is actually a complex thing that goes way beyond a simple definition. So first of all, I believe that humans, part of the reason we've, if you want to call it, succeeded, or at least survived as a species, is that somewhere along the way we kind of learned how to do a very very wide range of activities that require more than one of us. So a lot of species do have activities that they do as a group. And you can see, documentaries about a pack of wolves that are hunting, or a pride of lions, and how they interact with each other and what do they do. And you can also see things about insects that work as huge communal groups and so on. But humans, have a wide range of techniques and approaches to working with others. And I'm pretty sure I've been studying a lot about teams over the last 5 or 6 years, so I could try and explain things about teams. I think that in general, humans figured out how to accomplish something that an individual can't accomplish and alone. And so they've built all kinds of structures for working together as a group. And all of the early groupings of people were relatively small. I think that, you've heard of the Dunbar number, which talks about 150 people. Pardon me. So we have 150 people as being a maximum number of people that a human can kind of know well enough to act as a tribe or a community, whatever they want to call that. So, and this is one thing that I'm really fascinated about is what is that? What is the number and how does it work? And they talk about, even within Dunbar's stuff, I guess, of different sizes and what the limits are at those sizes. And we see this in organizations as well, that there's like a lot of times they break apart into departments, because you can't just have everybody, answering up to one boss individually. So they find ways to put together, mechanisms or contrivances of how to have a smaller number of people interacting with each other to be able to make the communication and the ability to work together possible. But this is what a company is about. We bring people together to accomplish something that we can't accomplish alone. So that's, the kind of the fundamental idea of having an organization is you're going to try to accomplish something that somebody alone can't do. Yeah.
So that's needing each other to achieve that goal.
Yeah.
On a larger
So
scale.
how we go about doing that is really broad. I believe that we work well when we can collaborate. And so there's very little work that is accomplished. And when I say work, that's a very generic term or general term. It could be organizing a picnic for your family, or building a cabin up at the church camp, or whatever it is. It's not necessarily what we would call work in the idea of we're getting paid to do the work. It's any kind of endeavor. But what we normally do in organizations is we want to collaborate, but we do it in the least effective manner. We break things apart, people working individually. We communicate through emails, or nowadays chat tools or whatever, like Slack, and so on. And so we know that collaborating is good, but we use the least effective manner to collaborate that exists. And the most direct manner is left for meetings or phone calls or whatever. So, as a matter of fact, I can turn around and grab a book off the shelf and open it up, and that's a form of communication. So there is a kind of collaboration going on, but there's no round tripping in that discussion. I can't even ask this person who wrote the book a question, because they're not sitting here with me. There's no easy way to get in touch with them. Maybe I send a letter, or find them in Twitter nowadays, but send a letter to their publisher, and so on and so on. So that's like the least effective manner. And then what's the most effective manner? Well, I don't really know, but one that's worked well for me is actually sitting with someone and working side by side on something. So yeah. So let's see where you want to go with this. What do we want to think about?
Well, this is pretty cool, because the effective ways of collaboration is essentially is I think one of the parts of this recipe to of making good and well functioning teams, right? And now we are in this Corona time where we can't physically be together, and we miss that. And some companies even made like a long-term promises to their employees that it might not even change for them. They might want to continue working from home. Like recently was Spotify who did that.
Yeah.
Last week actually, they announced that. So what would be your recommendations to make this recipe a bit better for the companies? What should be there to make a good team?
So I think that the idea of a team goes a little bit beyond having a common thing they want to achieve. So like there's a fellow named Alan Kelly who is an Agile expert. He considers himself an Agile guide, which is what I consider myself, an Agile and lean guide. He works out of London, and he's written some books, and he gives talks at conferences. And he talks about not doing things as a project, but rather have more of a product focus. Because products have a life that extends from whenever a person first starts using it till nobody uses it anymore. And the reason nobody uses it anymore could be that the company that wrote the product is no longer supporting it, so it's not keeping up with the times, or that it's no longer relevant. It's not relevant, so the people using it found other ways to do the things they're trying to do, so there's no longer a need to support it. So anyways, that's the life of the product. But a lot of people think of projects. So a project is sort of like, let's say we're going to build a deck off our backyard, off our kitchen or something. And so that's a project. You're going to gather the materials. You're going to bring a team in to build it. They're going to do, or you're going to do it yourself. So you bring in some friends to work on it. You do the work, and then it's done. And then everybody disperses, and it's over with. So if we have that focus, then the team has to be able to be put together and then dispersed. If it's like a group of our friends. So we're not going to just keep building decks. That's not our purpose. Was to get this one deck built. So if we have a product focus, we can think of the team as being something that should go beyond the original creation of the software. What often happens, I'm sure your listeners and maybe you have heard of Conway's law. You know of Conway.
Course, yes.
Okay, and so the idea that that an organization sort of the hierarchy or the model of the organization becomes imprinted on the software itself.
There's a really cool follow-up on this law, actually.
Yes, tell me.
It's like the reverse of it. Your organization will become good at what you build it for. So if you're going to focus or build your organization on the products, then you eventually is going to become better in that. If you're focusing your organization on the centers of excellence, then you'll become over time really good at those centers of excellence, and you're building silos, right? If you're going to focus on the value streams in your organization, you're going to get good at that. You're going to get really good value streams. If you're going to focus on the user journeys and put your org structure around that, then you'll be really good at that. It's a bit reverse thinking, right?
Yeah, I like that. And I'm sure, so also with Conway's law, the idea that once you've written the software, if you did it in a project-based hierarchy, then when you maintain that software, you have to basically have that same structure of the maintenance team. So the structure of the organization gets imprinted on the software. The structure of the maintenance team gets imprinted from the software onto the maintenance team. This is just the nature of it, because the software is written in the manner that required that you have a database team and you have a front-end team and so on, if that's what you do. So anyways, when we think in more of the product manner, then according to the way Alan Kelly thinks, and I agree with him on this, what you want is to have a team that gains the expertise that you think is reasonable and useful to your overall goals, and then you flow the work to the team. Instead of gathering a team around some work, you have a team that's become very competent, and you flow the work to the team. Now, teams are always dynamic. A team, even from day to day, even if you're working with the exact same people, people are dynamic things themselves. Today I come in, I've got a toothache. You know, tomorrow you come in and your wife just won the lottery, you know, and you're going, hey, is she going to leave me, or is she going to share that with me? You know, whatever it is, things change day to day. But if you lose one member of a team that's working well as a team, that team is essentially now changed. If you add a new member to the team, that team is, you really just have a new team. But I think that there are ways to keep the nature of the team evolving rather than very drastic changes. This is worth considering. I'm not really giving advice of any kind. I'm just making some observations. But the original teams I worked on in software development really were, oh, we need a database person, 2 front-end people, a back-end person, an object modeler, an architect. We throw them together, and we have 22 of these teams for this project. We put everybody into these teams, and it's just they're fungible. Oh, that database person's leaving. We need a new database person. We go get the database person. And the tester, we need a tester. Or the testing's on a completely other team, and so we don't even have a tester on this team. We just give them the work to test.
And I truly agree with you, and I think that this approach is more human-centric. It will deliver better results. I think if you have someone who takes care of your product, they will essentially, put a bit more of themselves on that, and you'll get better user satisfaction and many of the other positive outcomes of that.
Well, that would be the hope, of course.
Yeah, indeed.
And so the experience I think that Alan has had that's led him to share this, and that I've had, kind of tells me that focusing on flow is an important aspect of software development and lots of kinds of work. And so I think that that's really worth learning about and becoming expert at.
One of the patterns in business right now is that indeed you have the project team which builds something, and then they hand over to someone who will maintain that.
Right.
And then that could be in the in the areas of the optimized costs, which will essentially mean the cheaper labor, probably.
Yeah.
And here, the organizations afterwards, they pay the price for that. They get those teams who are not motivated on doing the stuff they're working on. People are changing very rapidly there. They lose expertise. They lose more than they would earn of having these full product life cycle teams on place. But
now, whether it's better for the business or not would be a different kind of judgment. But my experience is that, of course, business is itself a contrivance of human beings. It's not like part of nature that business exists. It's part of what humans have determined on how to manage things. If we go back to really the original businesses, it probably was people trading things. If I'm living in an area, let's go back far enough where there's tons of flint, and I figured out how to gather it or mine it or whatever, and I can then go off to somewhere else where they don't have any flint and get a bunch of furs or whatever it was I needed. So exactly how far back business goes, I wasn't alive in those days, so I don't really know. But at some point, business ventures began to grow into what we now consider business. And maybe some of the early ideas of business was, how are we going to govern things? Certainly writing, I've read, sort of was started so they could keep track of how are we going to collect taxes? How are we going to make the records for this? I don't know who first invented writing, but it's all guesses. I think people will say, oh, we think it was this, we think it was that.
It's part of the history, and yeah.
And so that was prehistory when those things were done, because nobody was writing history and writing their observations before we started writing. Before that, there was people doing pictographs and doing drawings and so on. So there's some hints at what things might have been like, but very little. But one thing archaeologists find is, if we find an artifact, let's just say in Sweden, that originated in Rome, then we can kind of make some guesses as to how did that thing get from Rome to Sweden, 800 years ago or 1,000 years ago or more. So if an archaeologist is finding a layer of materials and they find a cache of goods that came from across the world, and you gather data from all over the place, you can kind of say, okay, this kind of material came from, the very furthest east of Europe. It made itself to Rome, where it could be operated on to make it into something. It made itself made its way up to Germany in trading or attempting to overcome the people living there, and eventually made itself to Sweden, maybe by some Vikings who came through and were really good at taking everything from somebody else. And so, we can see, how did this happen? Some of it was trading, some of it was for the raw materials, and people have figured a lot of this stuff out. I find it to be quite interesting. So where did business start? I read a fascinating book. I think it was suggested to me by Esther Derby, I think that's where I first heard of it. It was just coming out, but it was called Accounting for Slavery.
Accounting for slavery. I have to like
Accounting for Slavery.
put
And
it up somewhere here.
what it was basically about was the mechanisms that had to be put in place to be able to manage a plantation in the West Indies, in the very earliest days of conquering Europe, trying to take over that part of the world, the Caribbean and that part of the world. It was essentially about the business practices that developed during that time. So that somebody, for example, if you were a wealthy person really growing a lot of wealth for yourself, and you found you could grow sugar by getting the rights to a big chunk of land somewhere in the Caribbean, did you want to live in London or did you want to live in the Caribbean? Where did you want to live? Well, you could go down there where you have none of the things that wealth gives you, or you could stay in London and have a business expert that you would send to manage your holdings. So how am I going to manage that when I'm only getting communication once every 3 months or whatever? There's ships that people probably don't realize this. We didn't have an internet back in those days, in the late 1500s, early 1600s. And so how are we going to do it? And so they built these mechanisms for managing this, what I would consider a very troubling way of having a workforce. And so now slavery has existed in many cultures going back, long period of time. So this just happens to be near the time, when this was being done through people in Europe who were conquering the New World. And so if this is really true, if that's a lot of our current business practices started during that time, in its day, those were the largest business concerns in existence. This was before the Industrial Revolution. Most people worked as individuals or in very small apprentice master type teams. Maybe, because like somebody like Stradivarius, who made violins, here's this master, and then he has some journeyman experts and a bunch of apprentices. And I actually worked with a violin maker when I was about 17 years old for about a year as an apprentice. It was a very informal thing, but my main job was to take tools and put them away, check tools for sharpness, sweep up, saw wood that was in the very, you can't get a big piece of maple or whatever, and you need to saw it down into smaller chunks that are going to be worked on to make a violin. And so I would be doing the dirty work and the lifting and all that stuff. And the master, he was doing the fine work. And so I understand a little bit about this process, but that's the way things were done, in Stradivarius' time and before. But now we had work at a greater scale. We needed to manage things in a different way. The Industrial Revolution, I believe, is sort of part of the beginning of that. Eventually, we got to, interchangeable parts and all this other stuff that's got us to where we are today.
It's the good area we're moving in, because now I think indeed a lot of financial practices came from those times, and that's because there was natural development of those. And also, as you said, a lot of management practices came from those times as well.
Yes.
And now, up until maybe like a decade back, or maybe 2 decades back, there were a lot of, or like all of major paradigms that we had out there for businesses were still originating in theories which were like either really old and just refreshed maybe 30, 40, 50 years back, adjusted a bit to the modern days and modern times. But essentially what happened is that the essence of work over the last couple of decades have changed, right? From this like industrial manufacturing and mass production, that's of course obviously after the Industrial Revolution, we came into the area of creative work and creative workers. And that's where we have new motivation paradigms, researched, maybe not used a lot. And that's where we are getting into these areas of like a teamwork and highly performing or highly effective teams, the team motivation, which is no longer individual motivation and not at all carrot and stick motivation types, which was like probably the most popular over the last, I don't know, 70
Yeah,
years.
and I'm sure it was highly dysfunctional.
Yeah.
So in other words, whoever was using these models previously, there's the old saying, things are the way they are because they were the way they were. And so this, I don't know who first said that, but I think that's a great quote. A lot of times people just do what they do and it evolves over time without really the conscious work we're doing on the system actually giving us the results we wanted out of it. But that's just kind of the way we do things. The whole idea of a system, so a business could be considered a sort of a system. But if the grandest scale, we can think of the ecosystem or the galaxy or things like that are systems. And systems evolve from wherever they're at constantly. So they started something as some small bit of a system, and it was useful enough to somebody or to not even useful, it just existed. But it exists in such a way that it could continue or perpetuate itself. And it eventually grows and grows because it's always evolving to deal with the constraints that are put on it. And it ends up where it is today because it went through that long time of evolution. Just like you could think of my human body as a system. We could think of humanity as a system, or the way that we propagate other humans and stuff as part of that system. And all of this stuff is beyond our control. Then we think we can run a business and we can use systems and they're within our control. And that's Bjarte Buksnes says out of Norway that a great difficulty is that in making change is that managers or whoever are afraid of losing control. They have a fear of losing control, but the control is almost always an illusion of control. But the fear is real. We want to feel that we're in control. We want to feel that we're able to control things and we can get some sort of certainty because of it. But it's mostly an illusion. But we don't want things to change because we're afraid of that change destroying our control. So we use things to keep it the way it is. This is sort of a part of what confirmation bias is about. Everybody talks about these biases nowadays, fallacies and so on. And I kind of think that must be true because we really don't, change is difficult for us to accept. We like new things, we like to see progress, but we're really afraid of losing control, even though we don't have control.
I had an excellent episode on this topic with two coaches from CRISP here in Sweden.
Oh yeah. They've got a lot of good things.
I have to still publish that though.
Yeah, you will eventually, right?
Yes. And if you're entering the system, then you would like to study the rules and play by those rules. And if the system tells you you have to check in at work at 9 or 8 o'clock, you have to check out from work at 5 o'clock, you have to do this amount of things, then you'll try to comply. Yeah. And it's within the human nature that, if you're going to get punished for doing something wrong, you'll get hurt, and then your brain will try to protect yourself, will defend you, so you won't be doing that anymore, right? So kind of it's true that the stick will work. And I think that's the reason why many people would, as you say, sit in the system and will not change anything because, they would be afraid to lift their heads because they're going to get punched.
Yes, so that's something that's an area we benefit from analyzing or thinking about. So if you join a company to work in a company, you pretty much are going to know that there's a certain norm in how we deal with work. So if you don't show up on time, if you come in drunk, if you constantly are breaking things way beyond what what the average is or whatever, you might not have that job very long. Like if you're incompetent at what you do and you're not very good at hiding that, you won't have that job very long, right?
That's true.
I would make, first of all, the arguments that the system that we have in place at most companies is not working. it's working really poorly.
In what sense?
Well, just for example, now I don't have the exact figures,
No.
but there was a time when a company that went onto the, Standard & Poor's or whatever as one of the companies that make up that listing, that system, you're going to be there for a certain number of years, or Dow Jones or whatever it is. And that number has been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking because things are moving fast now. And so where you might have been there for 50 years, nowadays a typical companies can be there for 15 years and so on. So are the systems we have actually working? If it's going to depend on what we think of as working. What does success mean? And things like that. So I don't know if we want to go too much in that direction, but I think that much of what the system of business is not working. There's a famous saying, I could look it up who said it, and that is that it goes something like this. Most companies get to the point where they can no longer succeed in spite of themselves. So let's talk about this with software development. If you can't make, as a company, a lot of money doing software development, you just might as well give up, because the margins of that you have in software development are huge. If you write something that's useful, like some of the first software I bought, the companies were successful even though their software was terrible, because people just wanted to have the software to use. And as time went by, if I was working at a company, well, let's say I writing the software for myself. One example, I'll just give a quick example. We had a manual process. We would take a long list of new companies, new contracting companies that we could get from the government, because anyone who registers as a contractor goes into the public record. So you can buy that public record for a very low price. And then now have this list of people who just started out in the contracting business. So we would manually type those in onto a sheet of paper that could be copied onto labels, and then peel off the labels and stick them on envelopes so we could send everybody a mailer. You might want to use our service. That's like an early version of the internet, right? But this was before the internet existed. So as soon as I was learning to program, one of the first things I did was say, that seems like we could automate that. Because I read something somewhere from a guy who's become quite famous as a programmer, but this was in the 80s, and he had said something effective: look for things that you do over and over again that are manually intensive, that you think a computer could do. That's a good place to start writing an application. So I looked around my company and said, that's something we could do. And so all I needed to do was have something where we could input the names and addresses, output the printed format that they come out, and then we could print it directly on labels. And so if we get a letter back that says this address is no good, we can remove that from our list. So basically I wrote a little mini database and a way to output that stuff. And this is sort of the thing. If that didn't pay me back at least as much as it took me to write the code, that would have been a complete failure. But what it did was it took a process that usually took somebody about a week to do whenever we got a new list. And then to continually maintain it every time we sent out mailings, they would come back. Some of them wouldn't be delivered, to maintain it, and then print out new labels or type in new labels onto a sheet. Lots of work. It turned it into something we could just keep adding to that list. And we started giving ourselves, did we send anybody a mailer? That went into the database. So we could just form a printout of the people who haven't yet received this mailer, and all this sort of stuff.
The first CRM system.
The return on my time programming was hours and hours and hours, 1,000 times the number of hours as it took me to conceptualize and write the program. Mm-hmm. But this was like, what if every company in the world wanted a mailing list application? Well, I had originally bought a mailing list application. It worked so poorly and corrupted my data so often, and it didn't have any of the features I wanted. Writing my own made sense. Probably making that available to others would have made a lot of sense, but I didn't want to get into the software business. But the point I'm making is, if your software development efforts aren't earning you back 1,000 times on the cost, why are you in this business? Why are you writing software? You need to make sure you're writing software that really pays you back. Then there's a lot of room for trying things, because not everything's going to pay off. Anyways, I diverged from where we were at.
No, it's quite good actually, because here we can maybe step a bit into the area of the more programming and effectiveness of that, because essentially, if maybe people are not super familiar with more programming, you could summarize it in a couple of words, and then we would come to the point where you would have a person who has the keyboard at his hands, and you have a bunch of people sitting around him, seemingly doing nothing, which might seem very inefficient process. And I think that's something that you are trying to explain at your workshops and seminars, why this is not really the truth.
So mob programming itself, to me, isn't a very important thing. It is the result of some really important things. So my career that took me through starting working at a place where they sort of figured out how to make it a great work environment, and then through many years of working at places and running my own little businesses where I was seeing all the troubles of trying to run a business, I eventually landed on this space where it became clear to me that we need to create an environment where great things can happen, and then great things will happen. We just don't really have control over what those great things will be. But that seems like a much better approach than saying, here's a great thing we want to make, let's go and make it, or let's go and do that. You create an environment where great things will happen and see what evolves, what grows out of that. To me, is a better, is a more meaningful approach. But that's just to me, okay? So if that's true, then the things that I started developing for myself starting in the late 90s, actually way before that, as I was starting to realize that I needed to change my thinking. Because I do want to make it clear to everyone, I started out having an example of an excellent boss, that first boss on my very first job. And then I went to other jobs where there were good examples of terrible bosses. And so when I really quite early on, I decided I'm just going to need to own my own company because I can't stand to work for these people. I'd rather, have that original boss. And he did, that job really wasn't available to me. I wasn't just a boy anymore. And so I started my own little companies. But I turned into the boss that I wouldn't want to have had for myself. In other words, I knew a good model for a boss, but I turned into the boss nobody would want. And when that finally came clear to me, I started trying to change back. How could I be like that first boss I had? And I started documenting that. I actually wrote down for myself, what was it he was doing? And in my story, my origination story with that, he respected me. Even though I was maybe 13 and he was 60, he treated me as if we were equals. Interesting. He made it clear that my job was important, that my job was valuable, meaningful. And it's a fulfilling thing to do, to learn how to care for a plant. That's a meaningful thing to do. He was instilling in me the qualities that he believed were important. As he asked for my help, he was actually realizing, I think himself, that if we have a tiny improvement habit, if every day we're looking for something to improve, we will get a huge benefit over time. So this original boss somehow had learned in his life, because he was probably a little younger than I am now when I worked for him. In his life, he had learned these lessons. How come he learned them, and why didn't the other bosses learn these? So here I am, over many years, trying to figure out how to influence the environment we're working in, so that we can get these benefits of having a great place to work, where great things can happen.
How to create the garden.
It's like being in the garden, and I'm doing a lot of gardening right now. A lot of modern gardeners will express this. You don't feed the plants. Like in farming, we had this nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. You have to have this right blend for the kind of plant, and you need to have the right trace minerals. But they're forgetting there's an environment in which both the plant and those minerals exist. That's where the attention needs to be given. So it's not the system within which a plant grows, or the conditions in which a plant grows, that we need to worry as much about as how do we create that condition. So if it's just giving it vitamins and giving it minerals and giving it different elements, that's not what it is, because the soil itself has a nature. Now, I don't know the science of this, but within the ground, there are organisms, fungus, and things like that. We need to understand what creates a great environment for those things, because they provide the environment that the plants need, and it's symbiotic. So when a plant dies, it feeds the system that it's living within. As other things, rain falls, it takes elements out of the sky. This is a huge thing. Early humans started farming, they believe, somewhere between 10 and 20,000 years ago. And these things weren't understood at all then, but they understood more, I think, about nature in some ways then. We perverted all of that as we came into this modern world. So I think I agree, the gardening idea is a good one. It's like we can nurture the environment, which will create an environment for whatever is living within it.
It's much more efficient because with the effort of maybe one person who will be responsible or will create that environment for the others, he could achieve the benefits of the others being effective, which would not be achievable otherwise, right?
So that's something I would need to give a lot of thought to. But the old saying is, you give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, you teach him how to fish, and then you can sell him fishing lures and fishing poles and all this other stuff for the rest of his life, right? So this is a business model. That's a joke, of course.
Of course, you mean that the teams should be able to kind of create that environment around themselves, and
this
that's
concept of self-organizing.
Yeah.
Right. So that we even can say we're going to allow you to self-organize implies we're in control of this thing. So management's a very difficult thing. Management, I pity all of us managers because we have a very hard job. What management usually focuses on is solving problems. And I think that's an opposite point of view. So then what is useful to us? So most of what management is doing is trying to I have a talk I give about this, and this is how I think of it. I believe the focus of management is misplaced, that we're focusing on the wrong thing when we're managing. It took me 20 years to learn that. From the time I quit working at the plant nursery, one of my earliest businesses was a landscaping business, and I hired a couple kids at school, and we would put landscapes in for people in this part of the world. They were building thousands of homes at that time, and everybody needed to have their yard landscaped, so there was lots of opportunity. As I went through all these different little businesses, it eventually became clear to me sometime in the 90s that the things I had learned when I was younger, and I worked at several companies that were actually quite good, those things I needed to learn how to apply them. So should I be training my employees, or should I have the opportunities available so they can self-select into what they felt they need to get trained with? Do I need to manage my employees, or can they come in the morning and somehow determine for themselves what's the correct thing to work on today? Now, I never got, I would consider an ideal environment during those times, but that's when I was experimenting with these things.
It's Ricardo Sandler's approach, more or less.
I used to come in at 5:30 or 6 in the morning to lay out the work for the day. So once my employees showed up, they can be getting the work done, because I had a small company, let's say 10 people. They could get to work without me having to guide them too much, so I could tend to the things only I could do, which at that time was interacting with certain customers, the most important customers and so on. So I would come in early, get everything organized for the day, go check on it frequently. That wasn't a good approach. What we eventually came up with is the idea that the teams, the people there can self-organize around the work. So they just need to have a way to know what that work is. And we devised our systems for that. So by the time I switched over to working in software development, I had a pretty good understanding of those things, but I was still just beginning. And in software development, most of the time the teams, so they take these, I would say, pretty smart people, and then act as if they're stupid. They say, you're going to come in at this time, you're going to work with these people, you're going to go to these meetings, you're going to report in this way, you're going to be evaluated like this. All of that is a contrivance. That's a system that we put in place to manage things because we think it gives us control. So my attention wasn't so much on teamwork as to how can we make it easier for people to get their work done. But the misplaced focus of management usually is, how can we make it easier to manage people?
For us to manage people.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is counterproductive because the goal itself will lead to all kinds of dysfunction. Now, there's a guy, Mark Graban, who He has a podcast too, but he has written a number of books. One of his books, I think, is called Measuring Success. I'm turning around to see where my copy is. I don't see it, but we can look it up later. He has one saying that he likes to use. We say we need to cut costs. The finance department says we got to cut costs. If we're going to meet payroll, so we need to cut costs. The actual goal in that case is to cut costs, and we will destroy our ability to bring in income simply because we need to cut costs. The one thing that generates the income that will pay to cover those costs is going to get harmed. He says a much better approach is to simply make it easier for people to do their work, and costs will automatically go down. This is very much lean thinking. This is part of what the whole idea of lean is. So mob programming itself is important, as it's a good thing to think about. But what led to the mob programming was these concepts that such as, let's make it easy for the people to get their work done. Let's make it possible for them to self-organize. One of my beliefs is that people doing the work are the ones who could best determine how to manage getting that work done. They don't need managers.
I think this is very powerful. Many large organizations still operate on these practices, as you say. The crisis hits the company. They say we need to cut costs, and they, would fire a bunch of people, and that would reduce their spendings over the year. And here you go, costs cut. And if they would focus instead on the internal inefficiencies that you have in the organization, which would make basically company work more efficient, which would allow them to maybe spend less money spend less time on internal processes, which would increase the turnover and would benefit the financial kind of flows. That would probably give the same financial effect, but maybe even longer lasting financial effect.
Well, so what we're talking about is somehow trying to modify or change the system that's in place. That's a very difficult thing. So we're still on the topic of mob programming. How did we get to mob programming? Well, one of the things I started understanding, in the first decade of the 2000s, was that the system itself has a nature that is beyond our control. So I like to think of it this way. This is unique with me, perhaps, but we have the work we're doing. And outside of the work we're doing, we have a system of work, which sort of is defined or not defined. It can be undefined of how we go about doing the work. So, originally, maybe when people started farming, they just noticed, and who knows, because I wasn't there and nobody was there, who knows how they figured out that, hey, we can actually control the planting of seeds. Whereas up to that time, they were just foraging, and they hypothesized that somebody noticed that where they were tossing out their garbage, the plants started growing in there from the seeds that they had, and they were growing healthier and bigger, and they started trying to replicate that environment. I've been watching a lot of movies lately, or documentaries on how did farming start, and there's at least 5 main theories as the pressures that caused farming to turn into something we would do. But anyways, they started trying to affect the system a little bit. So one of the features of a system is it resists change, or to put it a different way, it is extremely good at perpetuating itself. And the way it behaves when change is put on it, or the constraints are changed, is it will evolve to, the system will evolve to either get rid of this or change so it's no longer affecting it, or allow it to exist and not destroy itself. So the system wants to perpetuate itself. And a good system in a company, that's one of its main strengths. The system will perpetuate itself. That means any change we try to make is likely going to either fail or not give us the results we want it to have.
They will receive a certain amount of resistance, because for the system it's natural to maintain in a certain level of energy, speaking in terms of like physics. So that's what you will get for sure.
Right. So we don't know what that result will have. An example that I like to give is if we incentivize our developers that they work late when there's an emergency, they get an incentive for doing that. then we are incentivizing emergencies rather than incentivizing a work ethic. And so we think we're incentivizing some kind of a work ethic when the results could be very different. Now, I'm not saying that's the only possible result. We can cover that in a few minutes. Maybe remind me if you want to talk about it. But I think there's a huge problem in the way we incentivize things, the way people are given raises, the way they get promotions. I think that most businesses eventually, they fail to succeed because they can no longer succeed in spite of themselves. Because everything will grow to a point where the results, the return on what we're doing, that's what I think we got to earlier on, the return of doing software development, is so lucrative that we can grow and have all kinds of dysfunction and still be making lots of money. But eventually we'll get to a size and it's a way that it will just collapse on itself because all this system it's done is grow to a degree where it's all about perpetuating itself. And we can no longer get the innovation and the new products and everything that we started out thinking that's why we're here. And even the motivation. I worked at a company once that had 7 golden rules. These are the golden rules that if we follow these, the world is great. But all the employees were expected to follow these golden rules of how we behave. But it was really clear the management was not following any of those rules. And so, that had become a dysfunctional organization, and it did collapse on itself. It was a very highly respected firm, and collapsed on itself. So, anyways, back to mob programming and how all this relates.
There was so many topics in those couple of minutes that you've been discussing.
Well, but this is the whole point. This is really the point. This is not mob programming. Isn't some isolated technique that you can then learn and apply, and now you've got this technique. Mob programming is a concept. And to me, that concept is collaboration is good. How can we turn up the good on collaboration? This is one way we can turn up the good on collaboration.
It seems like it's a micro concept on how to make these large, maybe inefficient organizations to work in a smart way by creating these little bubbles where things are happening,
Right, the bubbles. Did we talk about bubbles before?
Nope.
So let's get to bubbles in a minute because you use that term. I like that term. So remind me to get back to bubbles. Here's the thing. And I'll mention Michael Sahota's name right now, because I think he wrote a paper or did some document I saw on the internet back in 2013, where he used the term bubble, and it applied directly to what the environment we had created where mob programming emerged. So the thing is that things are the way they are because the way they were. I think mob programming exists because I understood that we need to make it easy for people to do great things. We need to focus on turning up the good rather than on solving problems. We need to realize that we need to reflect frequently. We need to learn to work well together. We need to allow the people who are doing the work to figure out how to manage that work. We need to, so I'm saying we need to, that just is applying, that's the thinking that I had. I'm not saying you need to or other companies need to. I want to be really clear about that. I don't think I have a universal solution to anything. I know for myself that all the things that I thought were helping create an environment that worked, and I had enough experience by 2011 that I brought that with me. And in getting the job that I had, I explained that to the people who would hire me. And I essentially told them this: they had a team that was not working very well. They were not very effective. And they wanted to hire a manager who would fix this team, make them an effective team. And of course, they want a magician or they want a hero. And I actually told them, so they had gathered some of the managers who were going to be making the hiring decision. And I did not seek this job out. One of the developers on the team, they wanted to make that person the manager. And she didn't want to do that. She was like the lead developer. She liked developing. She didn't want to become a manager. So she knew she had to find some sucker to call and say, you should come and get this job. So she called me and said, would you be interested in this job? So I said, sure, I'd like to interview for it. I already had a good job where I had things working nicely, as we're discussing here, but this was a bigger challenge. So I came and interviewed. The managers who interviewed me were basically saying, what would you do and how would you fix it? And my boss, the one who had to make the actual hiring decision, would become my boss. He was the director of the department. told me later that they had already gone through 2 managers with this team and things were failing. And but I didn't know that at the moment. But this is what I told them. I said, this team is not doing well, not because the team isn't good. It's because the managers aren't good. You are the problem of this team. Now, I know that if I tell that to somebody and they still hire me, I've got a chance. But if they say, oh, this guy's a jerk, and they cast me out, then I don't have to deal with it because they're not ready to hear that message.
That's a very good approach.
So, but I was old enough. Remember, I wasn't a kid anymore. I already had a good job. That's one of the lessons my father had taught me when I was a kid. He said, the best time to look for a new job is when you already have a job. You stay there, you look for the new job, you don't move till then. But I'd learned for myself that the interview process isn't about them making a decision. It's about me making a decision.
Indeed.
I need to get enough information to know that this is a place where I would be able to be effective in my own work, that I could accomplish what I've set out to do. And a big part of what I had set out to do early on in software development was to focus on the people doing the work and making it easier for them, not just as a manager, just as a co-developer. And so if I'm a developer on a team, one of the things I'm going to do is all the behaviors like test-driven development, behavior-driven development later on, using good coding techniques and good naming techniques and all the things that we now talk about, clean code and refactoring.
These are the things that you could bring by entering the job. So at the interview, you should be able to see whether the organization is ready or not for that.
That's right.
For me, it was always, this was one of the parts of kind of the philosophy that I would go for when I was looking for a company.
Yes.
I have another part which says I should be able to learn from that organization that I'm going in.
Oh, yeah.
And if those two match, then I think, I mean, to me, it was good enough to kind of continue. And that it actually ended up with being some of the really, really cool places I've been working for.
I might have a skewed point of view on this. I was to the point in my career where I wanted to apply the things that I knew were working in a slightly larger space. Okay. So I knew I'm fully engaged in the continuous learning, but part of learning is to be able to actually try the things.
Experiment.
Experimental way. That's
try
right.
with different people and see if you can improve a little bit, if it works or not.
And exactly. Now I have about maybe 10 what I would consider fundamental experiences I had starting in 1999 in software development, and then through the years there was a big one in 2003. There was a big one in 2005 or 6. There was a really big one at the end of that particular job in 2008 or 9. And then this experience that I'm talking about right now, they all combine together that prove different concepts to me about why Agile or Lean or these kinds of concepts were useful. And I gathered those together. I put them in my note capturing system. And now I was looking for that opportunity where I could really apply them. And one of the things I insisted on when they hired me was no interference. They want to know, well, for how long? And I really wanted to say forever. If you were going to allow innovation, you cannot control it. Innovation isn't something you control. You create the environment where innovation can happen, and then look at what happens, and then act on that instead of saying, this is what we want to innovate, or that is what we want to innovate. And continuously look for the sprouting, the little things sprouting that could be big, and then you move forward with that. So all of this combined together, the insistence on having the ability to have no interference was very important to me. I wasn't going to take the job. Matter of fact, I was called into 7 different companies to interview at that time. I'd gone into interviews. I won't mention company names because some of them are big and quite well known. And every time I could tell this isn't a match. I was looking for the match. This was the match. So all those things that I'm talking about led to what mob programming happened. There's 2 or 3 other foundational things. One was that I believe that we need to study together. So my experience over the 10 years leading up to this was that having study periods set aside for the people involved to study regularly together is really critical. You'll learn some things for sure, but you will also learn how to interact with each other. So the study periods can be done in many different ways. I've experimented with, you would take a book and everybody reads a chapter and we come in and discuss it. But the one that I liked the most was where we actually sat and programmed together. And I had a lot of experience with that, doing refactoring and things like that within a company where we were able to gather whoever was interested, and we could spend an hour or two. We had one company an hour or two every day refactoring code, because it made the bosses think that, oh, at least they're working on code. But the real purpose was to learn, what does bad code look like? What does good code look like? How do we go from bad to good? And so
this is you learn how to learn together, because you learn individually
Yes.
during your life period of time. And here it's a new type of interaction, a teamwork.
Yes.
And that's we don't. I mean, here, at least in Scandinavia, there's a big focus in schools on how to interact together, and you do projects together. But
I think that's critical.
That's not typical for work. And I mean, especially if you work in a larger group of 5, 6 people, I don't think at schools you do that very often. And here you have to do and interact with those people daily. So it's really essential to set time aside for that and master
If we
it.
don't know how to collaborate, we can learn how to collaborate. If it's not in our nature to collaborate, as far as our own individual nature, we can still learn to do it. It's like, I think originally our ancestors and our genes, they got us to where we are now, has a wide array of skills that people had. Some of them were extremely good at collaborating. Some of them were really good at controlling other people and forcing them to do whatever. Like, I'm the king, you got to do what I'm telling you. There were people who were really good at hiding, and leaving the area quickly, and so on. So I'm sure in my past, I have some ancestors who are really good at trying to run things. So others who were good at just putting up with it. Some who were good at collaborating. Some who were good at running away. So I'm sure that all kind of came together, and that makes my mix. That makes me. But here's the thing: is that if we study together without the pressure of doing work, we have a different dynamic we can build. And we don't get that dynamic when we just are doing the work. It's hard to learn how to do something while we're doing the work. So often we do training sessions.
You get the pressure there when you do the work. So
the pressure gets in the way. And then we have all kinds of personality dysfunctions, or personality, I may be using the wrong term, but for example, many people will insist that we do things their way. And I like to quote my father. He used to say, there's 1,000 right ways to do anything. We should never think that ours is the one right way. So he was an engineer. He worked for, the equivalent of Ericsson in the US, which was a Bell telephone system. He wasn't a executive. He was an engineer. He was what we might think of as a systems engineer. He would design switching mechanisms and switching stations and stuff like that. And he was a troubleshooter. He did things like that. So anyways, I respect him a great deal, and I really regret that he's no longer with us, but I got a lot of good out of hearing what he had to say and describing things, and the way he would teach me as a boy and how to do things. When I was a kid, if you owned a car, there's a good chance you had to learn how to work on a car. And if you if you had a little property, and the water went bad, you had to know how to fix that, the heater, and you needed to do everything for yourself. And so that was a time when there was a lot of do-it-yourself going on, and I learned a lot of that from my father, how to make things, how to fix things. He was good at that stuff. Anyways, the learning together is a skill that we can develop for ourselves. So just by doing it, it starts rubbing off on us. So if we're learning together, for example, what we did with the mob programming, before we ever started mob programming, I had told the team that I was hired to manage that we were going to have a learning session. 3 hours every Friday were going to be set aside for us to learn together. You can come or not. That's your decision. You can participate. If you do come, you can participate or just watch. It's up to you. How you make this experience is up to you. You can sit at your desk alone and study. That's good. Or if you don't want to study, you can sit and work on some work, because the purpose of study is to improve our working environment. So this was work related. We had some people come to it. Some wanted to participate, some didn't. They would just watch, and that was fine.
I just
Yeah.
I just heard someone's head exploded.
I hope not.
Yes, because when you said 3 hours on Friday and you have a team of 5 people, that's 15 hours of work. That's like a 2 man days of the
Yes.
teamwork are gone. Boom.
Oh, well, let's talk
Exploded.
about that a little bit more. Well, let's come back to that and remind me of Sturman and Repenning. We'll talk about why this is so important.
Yep.
This is really critical, actually. To be successful, this very concept is massively important. This goes back to my very first work experience. Continuous improvement of our work environment. That's what this is about. Sturman and Repenning are professors at MIT. They wrote a paper about this. I'll share if you want in a little bit. So knowing that this would happen, but the people involved, so my goal, based on what I'd learned, was we were going to eventually spend 50% of our time studying together, not just 3 hours a week. And I think it should have been even more than that. And so let's really consider this. If we spend this time studying, we're going to be learning at least 2 things: how to study together, but also how to learn. We are also going to be learning the things we're specifically studying. That's a side benefit, but it's the obvious benefit. It's the obvious one, which makes it a little easier for us to have management say, yeah, you should learn these things. So we have a new technology we need to learn. That's what this time is for. But at the same time, we're learning how to interact. I've never been really great at interacting with other people. And so I personally I needed to force myself to learn to do these things. Now, I had these experiences when I was younger, playing in a band, playing sports in school, working on construction teams. I worked with some construction people this last week who were doing my roof. I wasn't doing any of the construction, but I watched them working and I learned quite a bit about how they interacted as a team. And I talked to their manager and said, I noticed your team works really well together. And he told me the story of how he had worked at another place until 2 years earlier. He was there for 20 years, but the interactions with the team was very dysfunctional. It wasn't good. And so this example he gave me really good of how it was hard to work at that other company, and working at this company was really easy because everybody worked well as a team. How do you learn to do that? You have role models. If you bring the team together to learn together, then some of the people are already good at it, and the ones who aren't will learn from seeing those examples. The ones who are really good can now elevate themselves into becoming good at sharing. How do we work with each other, with the rest of the team? They're now getting where they're good at explaining it or modeling it or thinking of experiments we can try. The other thing, though, was that I didn't want to tell them how we would learn together. I offered them. We could do a book study. We can look at some code. We can talk about it. One thing I'd experimented with in 2005 or 6 was we would all sit in the same room with one person at the computer and everyone else saying how we would refactor this code. So some person would share an idea, we'd try it. Someone else would make an observation, we'd try it. That was an early example of what turned into mob programming. So here it is many years later.
Just a quick question.
Yes.
Would you consider yourself like the creator or inventor of the mob programming?
Not an inventor at all. I would say it's like a discovery that others were making at the same time and over the same number of years. The discovery is that we can work as a team doing software development. And it's just like, let's say we're out in the world and we're looking for diamonds, and I'm going to find some diamonds over here, and you're going to find some diamonds over there. We're all discovering diamonds. There's nothing that unique about it. It's the same with ideas. Right now, there's probably a couple thousand great ideas just floating out there that are there because of whatever's happening in the world right now. And some people are plucking them in one part of the world, others are plucking them in another part of the world, and they eventually become a pattern. This is the idea of patterns of software development, which originated maybe with Christopher. Someone's going to have to remind me of the names. The guy who wrote the book on patterns in architecture. The guy was an architect who was talking about the patterns of design that just evolve. And when you can see 2 or 3 examples of this out in the wild, you can say we now see a pattern. And I believe we didn't invent anything. We just stumbled upon the idea of working as a team, as others have as well. But so we started talking about it. It was not generally accepted at that time, meant that we became recognized for this, whereas others who weren't talking about it maybe weren't getting recognized.
So you were sitting with the team and working together. I think that's where I interrupted you, kind of.
So we were sitting together to learn together, and we were giving them an option as to, I just asked the team, how do you want to do these study sessions? And somebody had come to one of my workshops or a user group meeting where I would do a coding dojo. And coding dojo is where you could take it as a social activity. You can have 5 or 6 or more people code together. And you have to have some pretty strict rules to be able to do that. Otherwise, it becomes chaos. So I was developing those rules of interaction for doing coding dojo exercises at user groups and little conferences. Somebody said, well, let's try that. Can it be used for learning? And I said, well, I think it can, because I had been using it for that. Let's give it a try. Because we chose that way to work is, I think, the reason we landed on the idea of mob programming. So here's the definition, basically, of mob programming. If we gather together all the skills, all the abilities, all the knowledge that we need to do the work at hand, we can work on that work very directly together. We can take one work item and everybody focuses on it at the same moment together. And we contribute our own expertise as to what we need to do. We will discover the path through this task, or this, let's say it's a story. So mob programming is where the 5 or 6 or 7 or more people sit at a single computer and they interact with each other to write the code, to write the documents, to test it, to do all the things we would do to get this code not just ready for deployment, but also deployed. So ideally, this small team is taking a work artifact from beginning to end as directly as possible. The main concept being that because all the knowledge is here, we can work very rapidly based on the feedback we're getting in an immediate sense. We're all staying in the same context, which allows us to share the cognitive load. And because we have all the different brains there, it's like a super brain. If my expertise is database, which at some point 20 years ago is something I knew a lot about, if my expertise is database and another one's front end, and another one's back end, another one's testing, another one is the product itself, they're the product owner, and we're all sitting together, I can contribute my expertise at just the right moment in just the right way. So if I'm noticing that the front end person says something like, well, what we need to know is which field is required. And we want to know it dynamically. As the database person, I'm going to go, hey, that's probably need to get stored somewhere, either in a configuration file or somewhere in the database. So I'm paying attention to that. At first, if the front end person was working alone, they might say, well, for now, I'll just hard code that into the application. And they're thinking, I got to talk to the database people later. So each individual is having to keep too many details in their own mind, and they're writing them down. And as they're working on it, they get a question, they have to ask somebody else. We're talking about when we're working separately, each person has to keep too much in their brain. And then it extends our cycle time. We can't work on it directly. We have to wait till someone else can share their time with us.
Also brings errors in the process.
So this is going to introduce errors. This is the idea of queuing. And according to Donald Reinertsen, who wrote the book on product development flow, he says queuing is the cause of the majority of waste in product development, and software development is a type of product development. And I'm pretty sure that's true. That's at least what I believe. And I like having my biases confirmed. So it's good to read a book that makes it clear that I'm right? But I also read the books that tell me, well, wait, maybe you're wrong. So I like this concept. The confirmation bias for me led me to read Ryerson, but I also want to know if I'm wrong about that. Ryertson's book is great. Matter of fact, I'm going to hold it up for you. I had it out on my desk earlier. The Principles of Product Development Flow. The bylines are this thing is a second generation lean product development. Second generation lean product development. I love it. It's a great book. I suggest you get a copy. Get a bunch of Post-it notes so you can stick notes in there and go through it 2 or 3 times. It is just chock full of really good stuff.
I'm terrible at reading books. I actually take the highlighter and I use that as well.
That's a great thing to do as well. And you can just read little bits of it. It's a book where you could skip to different spots, but it's dense. It's got a lot of information packed into it. So in doing mob programming, we're taking advantage of the lean concept of one-piece flow or single-piece flow. In manufacturing, you can see single-piece flow that an item goes from beginning to end directly with as little queuing and as little inventory as possible. That's a very simple description. So you know you have a problem in manufacturing if you walk onto the manufacturing floor and you see boxes and boxes and stacks of parts that are going to be put onto whatever it is you're making. If the factory is just full of the parts that you're going to do, that you're going to use, you're not doing single piece flow, because all of those parts should be being delivered or manufactured in a just-in-time manner. That just-in-time manner is what allows you to achieve flow in the manufacturing of something. Now, that's a difficult thing to do. Very few firms get there, but I had some experience with that back in the 70s. I worked at a company where they were essentially doing that. Nobody was talking about lean in those days. The word lean didn't exist till 15 years later or whatever. But I watched it happen, and I worked at this company. It was clear that it was the opposite of how the way most companies do their work, which is they make a bunch of stuff and then they sell it. And in this case, with the lean operation, something gets sold, so they make it. This is like you make it based on the demand of that moment. And a lot of this originated maybe through Deming and through the work that was being done in Japan after World War II. And we hear the terms used in conjunction with Toyota a lot. Toyota clearly went from a small bit to 2-bit little operation trying to make one little car at a time into a company that's one of the biggest manufacturers in the world.
In manufacturing, they're really good.
Yes.
Yeah. Again, the other guys I was talking to, they've been there and they've been saying that this looks great, but when it comes to the software development at the same company, they ask for their help.
Well, they should hire me, of course. No, I'm just
sure.
kidding, Toyota. I was just a joke. Do not. I love my car, and I do have a Toyota car. So please don't think I was being disrespectful. I apologize.
Why? I mean, it's good. Toyotas are great cars. I also have a subdivision of Toyota car, and I love it.
So what I learned when I started studying this stuff was that there was it was a complete paradigm shift from the way. So in the earlier years, before I was doing software development for a living, I was trying to internalize these ideas in my own little company where we were making custom. It was like custom manufacturing and making signage and other things in the advertising field. And so, so I don't know that I really completely understand it, but this idea of the single piece flow, if we do it in software development, we would take the idea that we want to create, and let's just say we're adding a feature to an application we already have. That idea we want to take from beginning to end directly without multitasking, without thinking about other things. Let's think about this one thing as a team. This is mob programming. If we can go from beginning to end without switching off to work on something else because it's more important or we're blocked, and we achieve that by having all the knowledge there with us. We don't need to go to someone else to get that information. Ideally, this is the ideal situation.
So, and you've started talking about these like the important concepts. The first was the common routines to learn together, the common kind of building up the knowledge and learning to collaborate. The second is to focus on one thing at a time and get it done.
Yes. So making it easy is another critical focus. So as a manager, we have to learn how to incorporate every brain that's in our organization to achieve these things. So I'm definitely going to offend a lot of managers out there, but I think the main job of management seems to be making it impossible to do anything So there's a famous quote from Peter Drucker. So I'm not a management guru, but Peter Drucker was a management guru. And his quote is basically, much of what we consider to be management is simply making it hard for people to work. And if that's true, and I read a lot. You can see I got some books here, but I've got hundreds and hundreds of books on my device, and I listen to them, I read them, and I often will diagram them for myself so I can understand how the ideas interconnect. I believe that I've seen this pattern over and over and over. From the very first jobs I had after my first experience as a child working, almost every job, I could go back probably and see how management made it difficult for people to get their work done. If we reverse that and find out how to make it easy for people to get their work done, and I like to say it this way, let's create an environment where great things can happen. And then they will happen. If we try to force it, I probably should tell a story about this. Do you want to hear a little bit more esoteric story, if that's the right term?
Absolutely, absolutely. Just before that,
somebody look up esoteric for me and let me know if I actually used it correctly here.
I think it's the correct one, but we'll see the story.
When
Just before
Yes,
that, in connection to the managers, the thing that you said. I mean, we have these like TNS Gallup surveys, right, about the employee engagements, and then we ask our questions like, why such a huge amount of people are not engaged at work? And this could be one of the reasons for that, right?
Yeah, I like that. So that's like the 12 or whatever questions you can ask.
Yeah,
like,
indeed. TNS
you get the training you need. Does somebody respect you every day? Do you have a friend at work? That kind of stuff, right?
Indeed, those ones.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think that's a great thing to do. I do warn you, managers, that trying to measure these things is probably a dysfunction or malfunction or whatever of management as well. That we think we can measure this kind of stuff. This is a faint whisper of maybe being able to get some information. But if we use it too rigorously, we're probably misusing it. So we have to be careful. We want to control things. So how are we going to know if people are happy? We're going to go take this survey, and every week we'll find out if they're happy. And of course, this is a thing we need to discuss. We probably got to be really careful with this. I think we can sense things as humans. We can sense things. I remember once I was with a group, and somebody brought this up, and I think it was really great. Humans are good at noticing little things kind of built into us. And they gave the example of, one of our ancestors is in the forest, and they hear a twig break. Now, they weren't paying attention to this, but they noticed it. They sensed it. And now it might be a predator. It might be a friend. It might be totally nothing. It might be a food source. It may be just something broke, but that we are good at sensing things. So let's use that. I liked that example. Because I know as a child, we were always listening for rattlesnakes. Because where we lived, there were rattlesnakes. But you hear that rattlesnake, you pay attention. I noticed many, many years later, I was walking down a trail and I noticed a rattlesnake. No sound, no sound. I saw the rattlesnake and then go, oh, that's a stick. As I got closer, I was cautious. So there's the precaution. I walked further down the trail. Oh, I see another rattlesnake. Oh no, it was a stick. I walked a little further down the trail. I saw a rattlesnake. It was a rattlesnake. My sensing for rattlesnakes was rather honed because as a child, we learned to watch for that. I've only known one person, by the way, who ever got bit, but it was a nasty thing. They didn't die from it, but we won't go into the details, but their arm was not pretty. Anyways, we can sense things and we are built to sense things. So let's hone that skill. That was just one example of it.
In Nordics here, probably everywhere else in the world as well, but there's quite popular concept of servant leadership. And again, the previous episode that you could watch is about that. But it's pretty good. And part of the being a servant leader is exactly being there and trying to sense what is going on.
Yes.
And the sensing is also, because we've been talking about the way, how do you reward the right behaviors? Maybe like what you just mentioned, the measuring is essential part of the business, because otherwise, how do you distribute the wealth benefits? Let's put it like that, right?
We got to talk about that sometime. I really do think that's one of the big problems in business.
Yeah.
Is that you get your promotions and all this based on these measurements that are probably faulty. That it's just us trying to control things that we can't really control, and that's the way management is done, because that's the way management used to be done. And I think we really have broken a broken system because of that. We think that that's reasonable, that we think that's meaningful. I like also the Scandinavian or maybe just Swedish idea of sufficiency.
Lagom.
What is sufficient? Lagom. And so is what sufficient? There's a lot of different ways to think about how we should exist. And I think business has basically skewed what is best for us. And it's just the nature. Business is a system that's grown out of what was. It's a contrivance of humans. We've allowed this to happen. We could probably allow it to disappear over time, and we could do things in a very different way. But living in today's world, we live with what we've got, but let's influence change for the better.
Let's talk about that, right? Because through conversations, through engaging the others, that's how you can get things changed.
Well, yeah, so the idea of servant leadership, I think, needs to grow a great deal. And we need to understand that every one of us in the organization has a leadership role. And if we don't take responsibility for that, then we're going to get what we've gotten already. And this is the problem. Like, we think that the coaches, like, I think of myself as an Agile guide. And the reason I like to think of this as a guide, I can think of it as like a wilderness guide or a guide in a city. If I was guiding you around a city, let's say that we were in Chicago, and I was an expert in Chicago, and you wanted to see Chicago, I should know, where is it safe to go and where is it sketchy to go? Now, I've been in a lot of cities. I've never had, please, people in Chicago, I've never had a bit of trouble in Chicago, but I was with someone who said, don't go down that street. Just don't go down that street. This street over here, this is the way we should go. Well, why? Because they know, they've been down that before and they had trouble down there. Now, I've had that in some cities myself. I won't mention any city names right now, but I've been mugged. I've had problems that we wish we never had. Having a guide can help us avoid some of that, but also having a guide can give us enough of that to learn for ourselves. So there's a lot that a guide can do. And some people think of it as a coach. I want to express something about coaching. I think coaching is good. I remember my high school coach in sports, in track. I ran track in high school. I wasn't particularly good. The coach was really good at using me, even though I wasn't very good. So he had some really good coaching skills. But one of the things that I noticed was I finished a race one day. I ran 2 miles. 2 miles, nobody talks about 2 miles anymore, but it's like a good long run, right? It takes you, as a really good high school runner, the good ones can do it in maybe 9 minutes or something, at least in those days. And somebody like me could do it in maybe 11 minutes. So I wasn't a very good runner.
That's
but,
like, how much is that in kilometers? Is it like 7?
Must be something like 2 miles, like 3.5 kilometers, maybe.
Okay, it's not, okay.
It's not super long. It's the longest track. Somebody can look it up and correct us in the comments. And so here's the thing. I ran the race one day and I determined myself, I'm going to win. I wanted to be first place. So my strategy was, whenever somebody tries to pass me, I will run a little bit faster till they give up. And then I can slow back down a little bit. And then if somebody tries to pass me, I will run a little faster. And I won that race. That wasn't a very good strategy. And here's why. I finished the race. Matter of fact, the last half a lap, which is 220 yards, nobody was challenging me. So I just took off as fast as I could. And I finished the race. I was so happy I won. And the coach came up and I thought he was going to say, boy, that was amazing. You really did great. But he said, well, I'm really glad you won, but you had too much energy at the end of the race. You could have had a much better time if you had paced yourself properly. So he taught me something about pacing. And this is what I learned from that experience right here. He could pay attention to things that I couldn't pay attention to because I was in the middle of the race. I wasn't able to tell who was behind me and when. All I could tell from the footfall, one of the things we had been taught earlier on was don't look over your shoulder. That just always loses time. Don't look over your shoulder. You just run your best race. So I could tell from the footfalls if somebody was trying to pass me, but I didn't have a full understanding of the race. Now he was watching. He could pay attention to everything that I couldn't pay attention to. So I've adopted that in my own coaching experiences to pay a lot of attention. And I actually learned some skills from some other coaches over the years in how to pay attention in an unobtrusive manner. How do you pay attention to a lot that's going on without others being self-conscious that they're being paid attention to? How do you involve yourself so it's safe to pay attention, and so on? So this was one of the things that I believe was useful to me as learning to coach. But as far as leadership goes, the main skill that I learned from Ainsley Nice and people like Diana Larson and maybe Esther Derby is you model the behaviors that you think are useful. And if others pick up on those behaviors and start doing them, then you'll learn something. Are they useful for us? And if they don't, you might be learning that these aren't going to work here. So that was, that was the beginning of me really becoming effective at this stuff. And I know it's troubling for people to have their manager as a coach. So you have to be really careful if that's the case.
Yeah, that's quite a popular trend right now to have people who would have hands-on expertise, and in the large organizations they would serve the formal roles, or they would have the formal roles of a manager as well. And combining those, you have to have quite a skill and understanding of what's going on in order to be part of the team, not standing above them.
Yeah, and I don't even know if it's possible. So that's something you just need to pay attention to and see if this is really working out. I've always really enjoyed just being on the team and influencing without being their leader or without being their boss. But there's that book from David Marquet,
yes.
whatever. It's Turn the Ship Around, and he talks about everybody is a leader, and so we need to make it possible for everyone to be the leader when it's the right moment to be the leader. But again, this then kind of says we're allowing you to be leaders, and so this is a problem because this is way beyond the way business kind of can exist.
This is complex, and
this is complex. Yeah.
And one of the to answer this question whether it's possible or not, if you think about that, if you would be able to decouple people's dependency on you as a person, then it is possible. And basically what you have to do, one of the major things which kind of where managers step in and do their job is when you talk about the salary, when you talk about the performance reviews. So if you will be able to take that apart or take that resolved on the team level, and there are techniques how to do that, then I think you can become part of the team and even have the formal role from the organization, but still play role of a team player in the team.
So that's one of the things I've had to do. For example, when we originated the idea of mob programming, I was still in the organization required to do performance reviews. So I had my own technique, which basically was for each person I needed to do a performance review for, I would bring them into my office, open up the software, and I would say, what would you want me to put for this? And what would you want me to put for that? And I would just do what they asked. I found people to be very good at self-evaluating. And I did not want the responsibility. I went to my boss, I told him that's what I was going to do, but because we still needed to do this. But I think that overall, that's a broken, I think performance reviews are a broken mechanism that doesn't make sense.
In that scheme that you describe, it's still you who take the person out of the, out of the crowd.
Yeah.
And you get him to your office. And that's
I think that was broken. I'm just saying I had to work within that realm to do it.
That was your best attempt to do it.
That was what was within the environment I was allowed to be allowed to do. However, I was already, so that was itself was a big change. But my main approach was we should not be basing promotions and bonuses and so on this kind of mechanism. I don't even know that promotions and bonuses and so on are useful to use anyways. It's just what we do. I've actually had people say, yeah, but with salespeople, you have to incentivize them. Like, what else have you tried? What else have you done? And at most organizations, I've actually had hundreds probably of this conversation because now I get to travel to all these companies. And almost everybody is giving some form of, well, that's the way business is done. That's their reasoning for everything they do. That's the way business is done.
When are you gonna get your paper describing how you think it should be done? So
no. See, that's the whole point. It's going to evolve. If we give it an opportunity to become, so I've shared the book. Let me get the copy of this book. You're in Sweden, right?
Correct.
So
yes.
did I share this book with you before?
Yes.
Okay, so it's worth at least familiarizing yourself with the work of Karin Tenelius, reading the book, and she shares lots of great ideas, or going and listening to her speak. I think she gives trainings. If I was there and had the opportunity to do it,
I'll try to
or maybe even online, I probably would take advantage of that. But the point is, I don't know what the future will be. I know that we have to change. And every organization is always changing, always changing. We are not in control of it. It is changing to adjust to the constraints that are around it. And we can think that if we change the constraints, we'll get the results we want. But as Donella Meadows, who's a famous systems thinker, would say, we will only temporarily get the result we want when we try to impose a change. It will backfire on us. That's not her exact words. It will backfire on us. Whatever we thought we wanted, we're going to get something different. So to use the quote from, is it Russell Acuff, who used to say, when managers can't measure what they want, they start wanting what they can measure. So this is the problem. We think we can measure happiness. So we get this mechanism for measuring it. And then we start wanting to get a better result on that measurement, not a better result on the happiness or on the joy and so on. Well, let's talk about bubble. Remember the bubble?
The bubble.
So let's cover the bubble real quickly and then guide me to the next things we want to cover. And we'll tie everything, not necessarily back together, but we'll tie up the loose ends a little bit. And whoever's watching this may have seen me talk before. Hopefully you'll edit most of the garbage out. You'll know that there's too much for us to cover in a podcast unless we're really focused on it. And I like this rambling way. As a matter of fact, if we had a whiteboard, I would have wanted to diagram all of this.
Yeah, that would be
I learned to diagram my conversations a long time ago. And I saw somebody tweet one of the diagrams that we did on a piece of paper at a conference 2 or 3 years ago, I guess. They tweeted it out and said, I was just remembering this. And it's almost what we're talking about here now. I wish I could get that drawing up. It's in Twitter somewhere. But this is the thing about the bubble. When I was hired on at that organization where we kind of stumbled upon the idea of mob programming, I knew I needed this no interference bubble. But I wasn't necessarily calling it the bubble. I think I was calling it umbrella. I needed this umbrella that would protect us from the rest of the organization. I believe that most people in most companies are spending most of their motivation and most of their energy on protecting themselves from the nonsense that's being generated by everyone else who's trying to protect themselves from the nonsense that is generated. In other words, it's like a self-fulfilling negative cycle where we're all just learning how to exist at this place we wish we weren't working. But we need to make a living, so let's make the best of it. I want the opposite. I want to come in every morning and say, I know I would rather not be working because I have so many things I want to do, but I'm so glad I'm coming here to work because I don't have all that negative stuff to deal with. I don't have to protect myself. So I wanted to protect the team. So I went to the boss who was hiring me, who would hire me if he did hire me. And I said, I need no interference. This team will not feel the pressure from the rest of the organization. They're going to figure out, this is exactly the words I used. You're looking for a hero to make this team great. The team itself is that hero. And you managers have been destroying their ability to make things great. Let's give them the freedom and maybe a little guidance, but maybe not. It's going to be, that's what I'm going to need to figure out while I'm here. They hired me as a permanent manager. I need to figure out, how do we free them up? Let's liberate them instead of try to control them. This was the bubble. So how do you get that? Well, there's a great drawing that Michael Sahota shared in an article he wrote back in 2013. He's probably been thinking about it and working with it for years before that. This is the idea of a pattern. If this same pattern shows up at different places, or the same thing, then it's a pattern. And then we can document it and talk about it and call it something. And he called it a bubble. So I've adopted that word of a bubble. We're operating within a bubble. This is what I imagined with our bubble. So if the team's isolated, that means we no longer have to do the stuff that other departments expect. Almost every department in most organizations is very territorial. If you're going to work with them, let's say, we're a development team, and then in another department, it's the database people. We need to deal with the database people the way the database people wish to be dealt with. So they're going to say, here's how you get our services. You fill out this document that requests a meeting. And if we deem that your document is correct, then we will arrange for a meeting based on our schedules. And then once we're with you, we're going to do a discovery phase, and so on and so on. So here's the way it often works. When things are territorial, let's say it's the deployment people, we can't just say we're ready to deploy, hit the button. They want a bunch of documentation and whatever, so on and so on.
Control boards, change board, release boards.
Yes. All of these things are just adding queuing and excess work. These are lean concepts to our process. We want to eliminate these things, not have them, but we feel we're in control. So we get to control our time, so we tell you how to work with us. I want to be protected from all of that. Okay, but we weren't completely allowed to do that at first, but that was the intention. This bubble meant that my boss had to be the go-between for anyone traditionally operating in the company who was not ready to work with a team that was rapidly innovating their process. But we knew there would be other people in the company who were ready to work with this. So my job as this team's manager was to seek out those people. So the bubble would allow me to go outside the bubble, permeate the membrane, to go out and find others who are ready to work with us. And that was a kind of our outreach process. Within the bubble, the team wouldn't be disturbed by those outside. This is where one of the things I'd already learned by that time, 2011, that estimates are not just useless to us, they're harmful to us. And so I won't work for a firm where I'm required to do estimates, or where the team's required to do estimates. I think it's actually a great disservice to our firms that we think the developers should be involved in the estimating process. That we can go to a developer and say, we want to know how long this will take. The actual work time of doing some work isn't the important thing. The queuing is the important thing. So if somebody estimates the work time, they have no clue what the queuing times are going to be, or the cycle time. They have no way to know that. And asking them how long it will take to do some work is just useless information that we think is useful. So we've clouded, we're dealing with a symptom of our system's problems instead of with the problem itself. Now, this is the thing about the bubble. If we could get this team to work, and I actually required on that job that I got a letter from the CEO that said this team is not allowed to do estimates. I requested that so that when other teams or other departments would come to me and want an estimate for some work, I would say, I'd really love to give you some estimates. But look, I got this letter from the CEO and he won't let me do it. So you're going to have to figure out this out yourself. What I would usually say is, talk to my boss. He's really good at estimating stuff, and he'll give you a number, the number that you need. So my boss had to ask as that go-between. But managers, you guys out there, you folks out there who are insisting on having developers do estimates, I would suggest you, as a manager of software development, that's who I'm talking about. If a manager of software development is asking their developers to do estimates, I would say you want to really do some introspection. and ask yourself, are you really capable of managing software development? Because if you don't know how long software development takes, what makes you think you can manage software development? You know, I've had different companies, a little contracting company, a landscaping company, and these things I've had. I would never go back to one of my employees and ask them, how long will it take you to mow that lawn? That's not where we get that information. How long will it take you to move the truck into position to raise this sign up to put it on the building? I wouldn't go to the worker to ask him those questions. I already have experience with those things. I'm an expert. That's what allows me to at least consider managing this stuff. That's something a manager already knows. If you think that a developer could know that, you're probably missing the boat. Tell me what you were going to say, Dennis.
Yes, I mean, we're getting promoted to the, well, according to one of the theories, to the level of our incompetency, right? So there are some points of time where we're new, or like those people who are managers, they are new as well. So they have to study, they have to learn. And I mean, you should allow this time frame for gathering the information as well. Don't be very strict on this.
But this is for the manager that's the skills of the manager. Asking for estimates from a developer, I think, is counterproductive. It actually is a pressure we're putting on a developer. I have a whole series of dysfunctions of this we could talk about someday. 3 of them that I share are the most common ones, but we don't have time to go into this today. But this was part of the bubble. I just didn't want the interference. At that point, I'd already worked about 5 years without estimates. And whenever if I needed to look for another job, I was insisting, that I wouldn't be doing any estimates. I know they're dysfunctional. That's my own belief. I could be completely wrong about it, but I'd love to have the conversation. If you think you must have estimates, maybe you need to think about a different way of getting those estimates. But I think it's different than that. So if we stay on the no estimates for a second, why do we do estimates is really important. And conceptually, there's only one real reason to do the estimates, and that's to make a decision. Now, I've done a workshop with many people. I probably asked these questions of thousands of people at different conferences. And the only real reasons I ever see is to make a decision, or the other common one, which is to spark a conversation. And then I'm asking, well, why are you having that conversation? Because we need to know more about what we're doing. Well, why do you need to know more about what you're doing? So we can decide what we're going to, oh, there we go. It's all leads up to making the decision. Estimates are a very faulty way of making this decision. What I found, I did some experiments back in 2002 and 2003 that proved to me that estimates were basically useless. And this is why I love Agile so much. The Agile concept is we're going to do short iterations. Those short iterations are there because they give us a very valuable learning opportunity, a discovery process that we don't get when we're trying to do things without iterations. It's the iterations that give us that learning opportunity that's going to change what it is we want to build. If we already know up front everything about what we're going to build, we don't need estimates. We might want to know a cost, but that will be a rock solid cost. If estimates were the actual cost, we wouldn't be calling them estimates. If an estimate was the actual time it would take us to complete this from start to finish, we wouldn't be calling them estimates. We'd be calling them the cost. So this is it's a misuse of this thing. People say, well, we need estimates so we can know the return on investment. It's not the return on investment. It's an estimate of the return on investment. How many things have you invested in that didn't return what you hoped they would? So let's find a different process. Let's figure out a different way to make decisions. It's not a different way to estimate or a different way to predict the future. We want to have a different way of actually learning so that we can make better decisions as we go. Now, a lot of managers are going to argue with me about this. And I've had all those arguments. I've probably heard every argument. An argument is just a justification or whatever for a way of thinking that there is. Yeah, I know that people don't agree with this. I'm fine with that.
I have to ask you, because this question is like at the top of my mind right now. If you're working on something which something else depends on, for example, you're working on the marketing, on the back end of the system, which will launch marketing campaigns for I don't know, Red Bull championship. So when the Red Bull should, start, that's how to do that.
Well, so the point of Agile is we get something working immediately, and then we get it as functional, the main functionality that we want as directly as we can, small versions of what might be our vision. Our vision might be, it can do this and it can do that. But right now, let's find, like Kent Beck says, find the most important thing and work on that till it is done or no longer the most important thing. I say it a little differently. Work on something that seems important, and from what you learn from that, will take you to the next thing that seems maybe more reasonable. So we will start learning, like it's the idea of a wicked problem. You don't even know what the problem is with a wicked problem until you start trying to make solutions for it. And then it reveals what the problems are. So here's the thing, rather than saying, so let's talk about marketing for a second, just from the idea of, if we want to start marketing this feature, when should we start marketing it? Well, that's not the problem. The problem is our marketing mechanism is not very lean. In other words, they think we need to have some lead time to know when we're going to start things. Well, why don't we just do it in conjunction with the actual development? And I'm not trying to give a solution or an answer.
That's the key. That's the key. If you can connect those things together, then you'll be able to do it in a good way. But
yes,
in my example, you are like a software campaign which develops a campaign website, and there are the other parties, which another organization is, and they have to do the planning on their side and do the preparations on their side. And if you don't have this good collaboration or connection together, you get into trouble. So maybe this is the key here.
Right. So we've misunderstood the problem. We're looking at a symptom of the problem. So the marketing example, believe it or not, that's one I've heard 100 times.
I can imagine, or maybe thousands.
Okay. So the point is, are we just expressing a symptom? Pardon me. Are we expressing a symptom rather than expressing a problem? My judgment is, my perception is, when I've dealt with these kinds of things over the decades, almost everything we define as a problem is actually a symptom. And this is why the turn up the good concept that I like so much exists for me. Because every time we try to solve a problem and it turns out it was just a symptom, we've essentially made things worse. And sometimes we've merely hidden the problem because we dealt with the symptom. I'll give you an example, just everybody's probably experienced this. I've got a headache today. I'm coming down with a cold. So I take a headache suppressant, like something that gets rid of the headache, and take a decongestant to get rid of the runny nose. And now I go out and do my normal day because I'm feeling fine. I'm spreading my germs around. And when I get home, I'm exhausted because I didn't deal with the problem I had. I dealt with the symptoms of the problem. Now, and there's a much bigger issue here. So we can't solve symptoms. Symptoms aren't a problem. They're the indication of a problem. But now the question is, we need to consider, can we solve problems? And this now goes into the realm of domains in the Cynefin idea of domains. In the simple domain, yeah, we can solve problems all night and day. Every time I make toast, the toast gets burnt because I set it for 3 minutes. So let's try setting it for 2.5 minutes. We can solve that kind of a problem. When we move into the complicated space, they used to call it simple space. I think they call it clear now. We move into the complicated space, we can still solve problems because there are no unknowns. In the complicated space in Cynefin, they think of that as being the world of known unknowns, but not unknown unknowns.
That's going to be the complex area, right?
That's a complicated area. Yeah, the complex area is we don't know what the unknowns are.
Indeed. You have to
and we need to discover them. So software development is about being in that complex space. So there's the 4 main domains that you see in most of the diagrams about Cynefin. You have clear, complicated, complex, and chaos. So an example of chaos would be, I'm making some biscuits. It's in the simple space. You get the can of biscuit stuff, you open it up, you put the little things on the pan, you set the thing for 350 degrees, you stick it in, everything's normal. You come back, you go, uh-oh, I forgot about the biscuits, and you go in and they caught fire. Now you've moved from simple to complex, to chaos in 1 second. Now your only choice is to put the fire out. Your choice isn't like, should I make some other biscuits? Or, maybe we should go out for dinner. No, you put the fire out. Now you've moved back into the simple space. And you can ask, hey, family, do you want to go get something else to eat? Or we can look at the biscuits and go, they're not burnt that bad. Let's cut off the burnt part, put it in the oven a little bit longer to get it toasted up, and we'll eat that stuff. You're back in the simple space. But whatever domain you're in, you might move, you might shift to one of the others. So if you're in the complex space and you start getting things like, let's say you're inventing a recipe for biscuits, you're inventing a new kind of way, an experience. You might experiment with that for a while, and then you go, oh, we can make a recipe out of this, and you've moved that into the complicated space. Because a recipe is different than opening the can of biscuit mix or biscuits pre-made and putting them on the thing. That's not a recipe. You just follow the 4 instructions and you get the same biscuits every time. So we move into these different levels. We could start off here and move it to there. But for a period of time, with software development, we're in the complex space. If we write this product and everybody likes it, but they want some more control over it, we might write a configuration mechanism so they can make a bunch of settings. And that will move it into the complicated space, where somebody would say, okay, we got this great software, and we just want to configure it. That's not the complex space, that's a complicated space. At least the way I look at it. I could be wrong. I'm sure everybody's going to tell me how I'm wrong. You'll see that come up in the comments. But can we move things to the simple space? We can. We can easily do that. For example, I use a tool. I don't know if you have these in Sweden, but this is a kind of a phone device I can carry around. Mm-hmm. And on this thing, I press a button and it shows me a map. That is the simple space. I can actually tell it, I want to get some hamburgers, and it will give me a list of places to get hamburgers. I'm in the simple space. I choose the place. It shows me how far it is and how to get there. We've moved into the simple space. But if I want to configure this phone, well, we've probably moved into the complex space, but certainly we've moved into the complicated space. And I can say, I want to work within 5 miles and things like that. You move around. But a lot of things that used to be complex have moved into complicated space. How many companies have a bunch of mathematicians? Every company used to have a not everyone, but I mean, every financial firm and every bank, and they had some mathematicians to do the math work. And now we do that with computers. The math is only done at a more conceptual level or a higher level than this. And that can go with design. Matter of fact, if you want to design your living room, you can open up your tablet, choose some colors and stuff, and it shows you a design. If that's what I want, you hit the button, and it gives you, it tells you how to order all that stuff. So yeah, we can move around. These things change over time. Back to estimates. Software development is in that complex space. If you are not working on stuff that's complex, you're not doing development. We call it software development because we're developing something, and developing something is a creative discovery process. If I was, who was a famous explorer from Scandinavia, like Leif Erikson, or who was the ones that went to Iceland and Greenland and North America? They didn't know what was out there. They knew there was something out there, or they'd fall off the edge of the earth, or whatever they believed in those days. They used mechanisms that allowed them to do a very extended discovery process. A guy like Christopher Columbus, who's not very well revered nowadays, but when he got in a boat and said, I got to go 6,000 miles in that direction, and I'm going to hit India, he was kind of a bit mistaken with that. He was trying to act like this was a complicated space, but it was a complex space. But who did he bring with him? He brought with him boat repairmen, ship repairmen, people who could do things to keep the exploration going. Otherwise, they would have failed. They had to know how to gather food as they went. They had to know how to do blacksmithing. They had to know how to take up one piece of metal and make it into something else. They had to know a lot of skills that allowed them to be great at exploring. Now, again, some of the things he did, pretty negative, but you get the point. Maybe a little bit better example of this would be me taking a hike when I was 30 years old. I knew I could find water anywhere. I just needed to know how to make that water safe. So that means I could take an extended hike that would have required that I carry 10 gallons of water and not need to carry the 10 gallons of water. So you take the knowledge with you as to how to do the journey. Now, when you're out on that journey, you might have lots of problems, but you can extend your journey as long as you need to if you build those skills. And that's about having the environment where great things can happen, rather than bringing all the tools you need with you, knowing how to construct them as you go. And there's tons of examples about this in every culture, in every part of the world. So we kind of touched on the no estimates. We've touched on the bubble. I want to finish up the bubble. Do we have time to do that?
Absolutely.
So I knew that if I had a bubble, I could watch some great things happening. But the reason I was reaching out into the rest of the company is my overall goal was to start or help others consider starting bubbles in their area. My philosophy was that at that moment was, if we could get enough bubbles started, they will be experiments at small new systems. And if we could get those bubbles to grow and somehow be related to each other, they could grow and interconnect and maybe eventually make the rest of the organization less critical or less necessary, and the desire for the rest of the system to perpetuate would slowly evaporate. That's purely hypothetical. But that was, I don't think there's enough years in any one person's life to experiment with this kind of thing, but that's what I was wanting to see. And I saw some other bubbles happen there. A couple other teams saw how we were working in completely other parts of the company. Like one part of the company where they did quality control of physically manufactured parts, injection molded plastic stuff. Their quality control department was managed in a very traditional manner. And they would then, they changed it, where the team would gather together, decide what they needed to do. All the reports were coming in. This plastic parts over here are failing. We've got to go figure that out. They would figure out how they would manage that themselves, and they did it as a team. I don't know if they continued doing it, but I saw these other little bubbles starting. And that's what I was hoping for. I was only there 4 years, so that there was no way to see it completely, but I had lots of conversations, and I saw at least 4 or 5 of those other bubbles starting. So that's my hypothesis, is that if we can, so let's talk about John Gall for just a quick minute. John Gall wrote the book on systems. Do we have time to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I just wanted to say, comment that the reason why these bubbles appeared is because people probably saw that it's safe to experiment, and they won't suffer from it.
So the others who could see the bubbles,
by example.
Yes. So if they could see a new leadership model, which was the team organizing themselves, they thought maybe it's possible for us. So this is modeling the behavior, just in the more macro sense in the organization, than the people who are on my team were modeling behaviors. It's just like when you're out on the street and you see somebody slip and somebody else comes over and helps them. When you see them do that behavior, you're going, I could help someone. And I watched my father do this as a child. My father often would do things. I don't know if he knew he was modeling behaviors I should adopt, but as I look back on it now, that must have been part of him somehow. I remember him once taking an uncle. We were getting in the car, and my dad had just installed seat belts. In those days, seat belts weren't there, So he had installed them on our car, and we all buckled up. And my uncle said, "Oh, I don't wear a seat belt. That's silly." And my dad said, "Hey, oh yeah, okay. Can I talk to you for a second about something else?" They went out of the car, and when they came back in, my uncle put on his seatbelt. What did my dad tell my uncle? Now, this was something I didn't learn till after my father had died. A cousin of mine who was there said, what your dad told my dad was, I want my kids to see a good example from me, that I'm using the safety device. Would you mind helping me show my kids this is okay? And my uncle came back in and put the seatbelt on. My dad diffused the situation and gave the justification for why my uncle should wear the seatbelt. Now, when my uncle's driving himself around, he won't wear the seatbelt. But this is the idea. We model a behavior And if we can model behavior, and I was never very good at this myself. I've tried to learn to do this. So that's the bubble. In an organization, John Gall talks about this. He basically, this is, I think, his most fundamental law, and he has a bunch of laws in his book, Systemantics, the Systems Bible. He says that that invariably a working complex system has evolved from a working simple system. Now, one of his other laws is there are very few simple working systems. So my experiment was, can we create an environment where we're allowed to have any number of simple systems to see which one would work, and then encourage it by using it and seeing how it evolves, how it evolves. So is that useful? Maybe, maybe not. But I've had enough experience with this. This is part of my concept of turn up the good. So if we see something that looks like it'll be helpful, let's let it evolve. I don't think we can have much effect on it. Back to what Donella Meadows said, when you attempt to influence a system, it will backfire on you. Again, that's not her words. You won't get the result that you wanted. You may never even see the real results of it because it's all very dark. None of this stuff is clear. We don't have a full light on this stuff. Right now, we see examples of this with the COVID-19 in the world. This is a very blatant example of we don't know how to control the systems we're in. We're trying our best to find ways to do that. The overall ecosystem is just teeming with life. It's just trying to find out how to perpetuate itself. And can we affect it? Well, I think hopefully we've learned we certainly can, and it's usually in a very negative way. So let's be cautious about thinking that we're in control of this.
I have one quick question to you. There is a concept or a theory, maybe it's called a model. Sorry, it's called pace layer model. But what they essentially say is that, and it's applicable for large organizations, that the organizations usually have different layers, and those layers kind of allow different pace there. And there's like a layer of I think they called like the system of record, the system of difference, and something else. I don't remember exact naming of it. The thing here is that these bubbles, they are, according to this model, they are very suitable for the top layer, which is where you can experiment, where you can make failures, and experiments should mean that you could fail and you don't know the outcome of what you do, right? Otherwise it wouldn't be an experiment. And if you lose something, well, you don't lose much, but if you win something, you can gain significant advantage. And for the organizations, they should have that layer no matter what, if they want to succeed and if they want to be part of the future. There's a middle layer where the systems are kind of semi-rigid. There's a certain level of flexibility there, or agility. And there's this bottom backbone layer where they say things are happening very slowly in a very waterfall level. Things don't happen that often and that much there. And if they happen, they're in a very controlled environments, in a very controlled manner. Could you relate to this? And what's your take on this? Do you think this bubble system would be applicable here? And I'm talking about systems like SAP, for example, the large ERP systems where backbone of businesses really runs on that. If you have manufacturing, your production capacities are running on that. If you stop them, it might crash you down.
Well, that's an extremely important thing to be paying attention to, because it's that need to keep these things going that sort of drives us to not being able to implement any kind of reasonable improvements. So it's things are the way they are because they were the way they were. Concept that we do things this way because it works. The problem is that the system outside of us is changing all the time. So if we think of our system of work and our system of management and our system of purpose as an isolated thing, we're also in the larger ecosystem of everything else in the world. And then that's in the larger ecosystem of everything that's in nature, everything that's in existence, everything that we can see, everything that we cannot see, everything that we can know, everything that we cannot know. And so what I believe usually happens is, this is the thing about, again, most businesses eventually get to the point where they can no longer succeed in spite of themselves. And so that's what this is about. So I just looked this up while you mentioned it. It's Gartner, Pace Layered Architecture. Okay, and so what I would argue is this, is that wherever we're at should not limit where we can go or what we can do. And usually the most organizations have locked themselves into something that, like what I used to say when I was in, I had my sign business, I observed a lot of companies who would come in, I would do their grand opening signs, I would do their building signs, and then a few years later, I'd do their going out of business signs. And we used to joke that for ourselves, that most businesses, they're going out of business the day they open. It's just that how long can they extend that period before they're really gone out of business? It's like a process of using up all the energy, all the money, everything. It becomes a sustainable business, but now the system of the business has become so locked in place that eventually, and there's so many examples of this in the world, they can't keep up anymore because it's become too controlled. Again, I'm not a business guru. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a researcher. I'm not an analyst. I'm not any of those things. I'm not a professor. I'm just somebody who's been really interested in observing these things and trying to improve my own little lot. My first real big stabs of this stuff was in the business, or big tries at this was in owning my own businesses. But I got so interested in software development, I didn't want to start a software development company. I just wanted to be doing software development. So when I got into that, then I saw all those same problems everywhere I worked. I said, boy, I want to know more about this. And if I made any little dent in that, I'm just so pleased that if I've made any little improvement for anybody anywhere, maybe I'll leave it with maybe we can end everything unless there's something else we need to tie up with this one thought. It's that it's the people. When I go to a company to do a workshop or help them learn mob programming, help learn how to work well as a team, my main hope is that I can help the individuals learn something that'll be useful to them. I don't have any, I don't know that I can have any effect on the organization, but I believe that I can help some of the people make their lives a little bit better and maybe their future's a little brighter. So I love the quote from Max Planck. I better get it word for word. A new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. So some people paraphrase that, and I do. Science advances one funeral at a time. Science advances one funeral at a time. So what I learned as a child from my original first boss stuck with me. It took me over 20 years from that time, let's see, 30, 35, 40 years before I realized I have to internalize those lessons and really learn to apply them and fix the bad boss I had becoming a more meaningful, more human, more gentle, whatever it is. And I've been on that journey since the early 90s. I thought I was trying to be a good boss all along, but I kind of learned that maybe I was doing a terrible job at it. I have lots of examples I can tell about that. So this is maybe, I'm trying to help that next generation at least have exposure to some ideas. And it doesn't matter how old that next generation is. They might be as old as I am, but I'm thinking about the next generation thinking. I want to give them enough ideas that they can move forward. And, we've all experienced this, I think, this idea that we can make the improvements. I want to, through my life and the work I'm doing, I want to give hope to others that, yeah, like with mob programming, how did we bring that forward? If we did it just by, following some simple principles, maybe I can do it, So people will, hopefully they'll think that way. That's my hope. I haven't done anything great. I've just done something that's a little incremental step beyond pair programming, a little step beyond Agile, a tiny step, But I think all of Agile exists because of all those tiny steps that others have made. I'm just one of the many making those steps. We're all stumbling in the same direction. And when somebody stumbles off in another direction, they might find something completely new, and we'll start stumbling in that direction.
So that's the whole thing of learning.
Yeah. So did we cover enough stuff? I mean, this is barely scratching the surface. I didn't get into any of the super negative stuff we could be thinking about. Maybe some other day.
Some other day, perhaps. And I really like the last things you said, and especially the paraphrase of this idea that science advances one funeral at a time. Because essentially, if you think about the change that it takes to make a change, it's a blink of an eye. It's just a thought that you have to make, an effort you have to make to start believing or seeing things in a new light. But it takes years for us to actually get there. And that's another question I have for myself, for the future, that I hopefully would try to find the answer. Why do we know things, but we don't do them? Why businesses know things and we have all the books and all the studies, but we kind of don't do them? And maybe you have answered that today to some extent, saying that things are,
There is a great book. I've mentioned a bunch of books. You know the one from Kahneman. The one is Thinking Fast and Slow. I think that's the name of it. So that gives a lot of insight into these things. And I think that was a good book for me to have read. I read it when it first came out. And then I got it in an Audible form, where I could listen to it so I could be on a flight and have something that that'll absorb me. It's just chock full of stuff about this. We think things are a certain way. Research, whether you believe it or not, is kind of telling us maybe they're not what we think they are. It's good to become familiar with all these ideas, all the biases. 50 years ago, I don't know how many people were talking about these biases. There were people who wrote about them way before that, even hundreds of years ago. But it's good to be familiar with them. There's so many things that we can try to improve. It's good to be aware, increase our ability to have the perception or the sensing of things.
Just one thing I need to ask you.
Yes,
the last
please.
thing, to maybe share 1 or 2 or 3 more books that you think you haven't mentioned but have made a significant impact on you as a professional or as a person.
So when I first started being really interested in business, realizing I probably need to have my own business, I read the books that were available at that time, but most of them were pretty limited in philosophy stuff. Now, I'm not suggesting anyone go out and buy this book, but there was a book written by P.T. Barnum, and there were many different versions of it that really sparked a lot of ideas in myself. I would have to look up the name of it, but it's sort of a biography. P.T. Barnum was a showman. Most people know of him. He had circuses and he had museums and stuff. And his whole attitude seemed to be, I don't care how I got the customer, as long as they're happy. As long as they're glad they became my customer. So he did a lot of stuff that we nowadays would probably think is being deceptive, but his basic philosophy was that's kind of a good thing, is that we're here to serve someone else. Now, in most of this, we're thinking we're here to serve someone else so we can make a living. Okay, but let's elevate that a little bit. So I'm not suggesting you go and buy that book. I found it to be a lot of fun. He talks about his failures really openly, and he mostly just failed throughout his career. His buildings burnt down. The world changed over time. He had all kinds of disasters. Somehow he always rose up from the ashes. So that's kind of helped me throughout my career. Another one from way back when, everybody has seen the book and read it probably, would be that 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. That's a pretty good one. These are really basic books. Another one I'll share is from Nancy Klein, Time to Think. And then she wrote another book that's called More Time to Think. So they're both really good. And I read them both, and they both helped me quite a bit. I got good ideas. About working together and working better together. And one of the things, the really big concept I got for her is, if you listen well, that's like a gift to the person who's talking and doing the thinking. And one thing she said was that I really have adopted for myself, that I practice, I'm not very good at it, is listen to the other person as if the next thing they say will be the most important thing you will have ever heard. I practice that usually daily. It's exhausting. It wears you out. We're not used to it, but it helps you become a better listener. So, but she has lots of other things. I don't necessarily agree with everything she says, but I don't agree with everything anybody says. So, yeah, but it's a great book. I like that. And maybe one more.
One more or two more.
One of the books that was fundamental to me early on, if we're talking about business, was that one, I think it was called, it was about Trout and Reese, I think was the name of the people who wrote it, Positioning. That means you have to be prepared. You have to get your ideas into someone else's psyche or whatever. So when they need to make the decision, yours is up there. So like you see thousands of advertisements in the United States for Coca-Cola. Everybody knows what Coca-Cola is. It's available. Nobody has to tell you what Coca-Cola is, but they understand this positioning that if Coca-Cola is one at the top of the list of things when you think about getting a soft drink, that helps their business. So to take that back to our level right here, right now, is that I've worked really hard at having ways to get like mob programming and all these other concepts available in people's thinking. So when it's time for them to consider these things, they'll go, oh, I heard about this thing. That's positioning. So like if somebody hears me talk about no estimates, and I've had people come up to me later and say this, I didn't think what you were talking about made any sense at all. But now it's like 5 years or even now almost 10 years later, and we aren't doing estimates where we work. We've realized that we're being harmful to us. So you plant the idea, maybe it's useful to them, maybe it's not. So that was a good book. If I read it again now, that was literally, I bet you that book's over 30 years old. It might be 35 years old.
That's powerful.
But that was a book that was important in my thinking about my business and how do I do business, but then now later, how do I share ideas that I think are useful? I have these ideas in me that I think are good for us to at least consider. So there you go. If I turned around, I could probably look at a dozen more books. So on teams itself, the work by Amy Edmondson in the book Teaming, she's a professor from Harvard. She basically, the main takeaway from that book for me was there are no longer any problems in the knowledge field, in knowledge work, that are one-person problems. So let's stop thinking we're going to be inventing and coming up with solutions as individuals. It really requires that we get good at teamwork. So why don't we find the best ways to do teamwork? Again, I think that's brilliant. And that's one that I can recommend. And I'll leave you with one last book from Linda Rising. If you know of Linda Rising, her book called Fearless Change, I think it's her first book. She's written several books, but Linda Rising, she's a woman who has been paying attention to the patterns of change for decades and has written about it and talked about it and shares about it. She also has a second book on that topic called More Fearless Change. So yeah,
popular trend.
So yeah, it's a good trend. So I've used that book. It's about influencing change when you really don't have the power to make the change happen. So that's what we're talking about here today overall. It's like, what are good ideas to be thinking about it? If we involve others in thinking about it, that will help us and might help them. And after a while, the patterns of these things will grow and maybe we can get some results. We need teamwork more now than ever in the world. And it seems like the political systems in place make teamwork next to impossible. So we need to find ways to not just collaborate in our companies, across companies and across industries and across political systems, across the world, across countries. We need to emphasize the collaboration, not the competitiveness.
So let's hope that we will plant the seeds for this to happen in the future.
Yes.
And let's
and then, right, 100 years from now, somebody will come up to me and say, "Thank you so much for sharing those ideas."
indeed. I mean, within the next 40 years, the medicine will going to get significant improvements ahead, so that will be totally possible.
Well, we'll see. We'll see.
We'll just have to last a little bit longer.
Or people could come and dance on my grave. That would be okay too, as they say.
No. It really reminds me the Isaac Asimov the trilogy that what's it called, the Foundation, I think. I read it when I was really a small kid, and I will cut this bullshit away because I think.
Oh no. Yeah, so sharing these little snippets of ideas is a good thing too.
Oh,
I love sitting down at a conference and starting a conversation and diagramming it as we go, and to see where we go. I've done that more than several times. You get a couple of people talking, you start kind of diagramming what we're talking about, where we're going, and it's a journey. It's a wonderful, powerful thing.
Then I think we covered a lot, and we had very good flow, I think. I mean, I enjoyed it really much, and I was trying to do
We
my
probably
best.
went off on some tangents that we didn't finish. So
Yeah.
but go ahead. Yeah.
But I was trying to do my best in giving you the opportunity to talk without asking too many questions. Maybe.
Oh, I enjoyed it. Thank you for giving. That was a gift to me. And you can see that I'm good at cutting off people in the mid-sentence. That's something I've been working on for years. So
Okay.
I don't want to be doing that, and I apologize. Each one of us can make an improvement, and
it'll be tough.
Yeah.
I can tell you, because we've been jumping from topic to topic. We had a flow, I think.
We definitely had a flow. So almost everything that we talked about was part of the thing that came before it, but that I didn't always circle back.
No.
Is something that happened to me. So there were some things that were critical to circle back on, and I tried to do that, but we might have left some loose ends still. It's what it is. It's
what it is, indeed. We are iterating here, right?
That's right.
Trying it out. So it will be like that. And then, Woody, really thank you for being here. I really appreciated talking to you.
I had a great time here.
Wish you a very good afternoon and great weekend.
All righty. You too.